The narrator thinks about how he just wanted to be someone who could help others. He wanted to be like his great father who fought to save the world, while he sits on the ground totally spent, surrounded by a pack of monsters in the middle of the woods. He makes it clear that he never actually cared about being a hero. He just wanted to be the kind of person who could protect someone. The story jumps back to a few hours earlier in the city, showing a normal morning on a busy street where people are just going about their day. Up in a room behind a small stone window, a kid is lying in bed looking like he didn't get any sleep at all. Urius Curtis, a 13-year-old student at the Magic Academy, says he's still exhausted, but he knows he's got to get up and start his day. It's been 150 years since humans lost the war against demons and got forced into hiding. They ended up building this massive place called the Barrier City, a last stand for everyone left, and outside those walls, it's a total nightmare. The sun never really comes up, leaving the world in a permanent twilight where all these freaky demons are just waiting for a chance to attack. So to fight back, people built these magic academies to train a new generation of mages. They're all working toward the same goal, eventually clearing out the monsters and bringing the light back to the world. That brings us back to Urius, who's finally dressed in his academy uniform and cape. He's standing there looking ready for whatever the day throws at him, and he thinks about how being a student at this school was always his biggest goal. He's got a pretty serious look on his face as he heads out, but first he stops by his desk to look at an old photo. It's a picture of his parents from back in the day, just standing there together. He gives the photo a quick, confident smile and tells his mom and dad that he's heading out now. The door shuts behind him, leaving the room quiet and the photo sitting there on the table. Turns out his dad was a mage who died in battle against the demons when Urius was just a little kid, and his mom passed away from a sickness right around the same time, leaving him alone. But he says he never actually felt lonely. He's got something to keep him going, a dream to become a great mage just like his father was. Urius is walking through the school grounds when he hears his name. A group of students is waving him over from across the courtyard, and as he catches up, the guy with the spiky hair tells him he's counting on him for today's session. Urius just gives a simple nod, saying he knows the drill. Things are getting serious at the academy lately because they've finally started real combat lessons. It's pretty intense. Students have to actually go outside the walls to hunt monsters, which is the only way to prove they're ready to be real mages. Urius looks a bit stressed, wondering if they're actually ready to head out there since they're still so new at this. His teammate noticed him overthinking and tells him to stop being so nervous, but the guy keeps talking, laying out the strategy. He says he and Leona will take the lead on the front line while Nora handles the back, leaving Urius to focus on his healing and using illusions to mess with the monster's head. He's clearly thinking big, saying that if they can actually pull this off in such a dangerous spot, their grades and reputation at the school are going to blow up. The guy gets even more hype, telling Urius they should just keep hunting and moving up until they finally hit S rank, which is the absolute peak. Every student at the academy spends their life dreaming of reaching that level, looking up to the legends who made it to the top. Most mages are stuck somewhere between A and E rank, but the S ranks are in a league of their own. They're basically seen as the last hope humanity has left against the monsters, though Urius can't help but feel like all that talk is for someone else. He's stuck at E rank and doesn't think he'll ever get close to that level, but then his friend speaks up again. The spiky-haired leader makes it clear that they're the ones in charge of the report once they're back at the academy. Urius is basically just a tag-along for this mission, and Urius tries to argue, pointing out that he's supposed to be a real member of the team too. He looks pretty stressed about being sidelined, but the leader shuts him down fast, saying it's fine since their power levels aren't even close. He tells the kid to remember his place before he tries to talk back. Urius just forces a smile and says he gets it, realizing there's no point in arguing with them right now. As they move deeper into the woods, the other guy asks Dan if they've officially hit the danger zone yet. Dan looks a little on edge, admitting that they probably have, and then Urius spots something in the brush. He tells everyone to hold up and look at what's right in front of them. The whole group stops as two massive, lizard-like monsters with huge claws step out of the trees to block their path. Dan recognizes them as claw lizards right away. He gets this cocky grin and says these things aren't bad at all for their first real cat, and with a look of pure confidence, he gives the signal to move in and start the hunt. The frontliners don't waste any time. They leap into action with their weapons drawn, ready to tear through the monsters. The fight kicks off with one of the lizards getting sliced right down the middle, and Nora doesn't slow down. She hovers in the air and starts her chant to back up the front line. A massive burst of magic hits another monster, blowing it away as the group pushes their advantage. Dan looks hyped, yelling that they can totally do this if they just keep up the pressure. But then the situation takes a turn. A huge pack of the monsters crawls out of the trees, and Urius tries to warn Dan that they're outnumbered, but Dan just snaps at him to shut up because he already knows. The group finds themselves completely surrounded with monsters closing in from every side, so Dan tells Urius he needs to be the bait to draw them all in so the rest of the party can strike from behind. Urius is hesitant, but Dan yells that they're all dead if he doesn't move, leaving Urias with no choice but to agree. He closes his eyes and focuses, pushing his physical reinforcement magic to its absolute limit before jumping into the mess. Urias kicks off with a burst of speed, moving so fast he's just a blur across the ground. He lets out a shout and swings his blade, catching one of the lizards clean through the neck as he passes. Another monster lunges at him from the side, but Urias doesn't panic. He keeps his cool and triggers his illusion magic to summon a massive glowing axe. The lizards are completely caught off guard by the spectral weapon, standing there totally confused while Urias keeps pushing his body past the limit. He's sweating and breathing hard, telling himself he's got to keep moving and find a way out of this mess. He swings his sword like his life depends on it, but the sounds of Dan and the rest of the party talking in the distance start to fade away until everything goes quiet. Urias stands there alone in the clearing, just trying to get some air back into his lungs. The ground around him is a total disaster, covered in blood and the bodies of all the monsters he just took down by himself. He looks down at one of the shredded corpses, his eyes looking heavy and completely drained from the fight. It finally sinks in that Dan and the others didn't even try to fight. They just ditched him, ran away, and never looked back. Urias stands there as the memory of his teammates flashes through his head. It finally clicks that they were planning this the whole time, openly talking about ditching him to save their own skin. He looks down at his boots soaked in monster blood, thinking about how he actually expected them to betray him eventually. But now that it's actually happened, he can't stop shaking from the shock, feeling a deep, empty sadness that he just can't shake off. He tries to pull himself together and head back, but he's so exhausted he drops his sword, feeling like he's hit his absolute limit until he sees something strange ahead. A giant glowing grid starts to block the path right in front of him. He reaches out and realizes it's an anti-magic barrier. He can feel Leona's magic coming off the wall and realizes the truth. They didn't just run. They locked him in here with the monsters on purpose, showing just how much they really hated him. Urias turns away from the barrier, knowing for sure that there's no way for him to go back home anymore. The days start to blur together as Urias struggles to survive, losing track of exactly how long he's been trapped in the dark. Urias finally accepts that he's never going back to the barrier city, but he keeps putting one foot in front of the other because he's just not ready to give up on life yet. He knows the twilight out here is actually toxic to humans, and he starts to worry about what's going to happen to his body if he stays exposed for too long. The terrain is rough, and he's barely hanging on, stumbling over the jagged rocks as his strength completely gives out, and he ends up losing his balance entirely, taking a nasty spill and slamming hard into the ground. Urias is just sprawled out in the dirt now, looking totally defeated and motionless. He lies there with his face pressed into the cold earth, too exhausted to even move a muscle. Looking completely broken, he asks himself how his life could have possibly ended up in a mess like this. Images of Dan and the rest of the group flash through his mind, sparking a wave of pure bitterness, though even that anger is starting to feel far away and blurry, leaving him with nothing but a desperate, simple urge to survive and a fear of dying out here alone. But just as he's about to fade out, his eyes snap open. He feels something weird happening right next to him. Urias is just hanging his head, feeling like he's hit rock bottom. But then he feels a weird sensation on his arm and quickly pulls his sleeve back to check it out. He completely freezes at what he sees, and his eyes go wide with total shock. He can't believe his own eyes as he looks down at his body. Standing there, he just stares at his arm, which is now covered in these creepy, dark vein-like patterns that look like they're alive. Urias can barely get the words out, asking himself what is even happening to him right now. He wonders if the toxic magic from the twilight is actually starting to eat him alive, since he's never seen anything like this before. He knows this air is poison, but this transformation is something else entirely. He just sits there in the dirt, looking totally exhausted, and ends up letting out a dark, empty laugh at how messed up everything has gotten. It makes sense he doesn't know what's going on, because no mage has ever survived out here this long. He's probably the only human ever to be soaked in this much toxic energy. So at this point, he figures anything could happen. And if he dies here, he's just done. But then he hears a loud rustle in the trees nearby, and this massive, terrifying demon with giant blade arms shows up right in front of him, looking ready to end it all. Urias just stares blankly, looking totally drained of life. He recognizes the monster as a claw lizard boss and realizes he's probably about to be its next meal. But the demon lizard just keeps staring him down with that massive, creepy eyeball. It's a death sentence, but Urias can't help thinking about how starving he is and how long it's been since he actually ate anything. He's basically accepted that he's just going to die right here. It hits him hard that he's dying without ever becoming someone important or doing anything with his life. He grits his teeth in pure frustration, looking down at the dark, living patterns still spreading across his arm, and suddenly he just loses it, screaming at the top of his lungs, while these strange spirals start spinning in his eyes. He yells out that his dream was to be someone who actually helps people, not just some throwaway pawn to be left behind in the dirt, and the monster doesn't care, just towering over him with its jaws wide open. Urias can't stand the thought of it all ending in a place like this. His focus sharpens, and he decides right then that he's going to kill the thing in front of him, but he knows he needs a weapon to make it happen. He tries to manifest something in his hand, wondering if he can create what he needs with an illusion, but then he just starts laughing at how stupid that sounds since an illusion isn't even real. He stops himself mid-thought though, like something just clicked in his head, and tells himself to wait a second. Urias reaches down and grabs a random piece of wood from the ground. His body just starts moving on its own before he even has time to think about it. He knows illusion magic is usually just for distracting people, but in this moment, things feel different. He gets this feeling that he can actually pull this off as energy starts wrapping around the stick. He realizes a fake sword is useless because it'll just vanish the second it hits something. So he asks himself what the fix is and decides he just has to force the illusion to become a permanent part of the real world. The lizard monster lunges with its massive jaws wide open, but Urias doesn't flinch and charges straight in. He swings with everything he's got, shredding the creature into a mess of black blood and limb. The dust settles and Urias is standing there, holding a solid, jagged black blade that definitely isn't an illusion anymore. He stands alone among the wreckage of the boss, realizing that this is just the beginning for him. Urias looks ahead with a new fire in his eyes. This moment marks the actual start of his new life. He stands there in the quiet wasteland when his stomach suddenly lets out a loud growl. Urias admits he's pretty hungry, then looks at the dead monster and wonders if he should actually try eating it. And just like that, a whole year passes by while he's stuck out there. Urias is still in the same spot, but his hair is longer and he's casually snacking on monster meat. He still hasn't found a way out of the twilight, so he just keeps wandering and eating whatever he hunts to stay alive. He's starting to figure out how this place works, like how the monsters are powered by this weird aura they have. Then there's his weapon, the jagged black blade he first pulled out during that big fight. He realizes the sword actually sucks up the energy from his enemies and lets him use that power for himself. It seems to be connected to the mark on his arm, even if he hasn't fully figured out the details yet. Urias knows that no matter what else happens in this weird twilight world, the only thing that matters is survival of the fittest, and he's realized the only way to actually stay alive is to use every single tool and power he has at his disposal. He closes his eyes for a second, feeling the weight of it all and just wishing he could go back home soon. At this point, he doesn't even care if it's the third barrier city or somewhere else, but he hasn't found anything and wonders if his sense of direction is just that bad. Urias keeps walking through the rocky canyon, wandering deeper into the wasteland, until he suddenly stops dead in his track, looking completely shocked by what's waiting just around the corner. In front of him sits a small cluster of huts made from wood and straw, looking like a real village. He stands there with his mouth open, asking himself if he's actually found an honest-to-God human settlement. After a whole year of surviving alone, nearly dying, and being betrayed, he spent every day just wanting to go home, and now he's finally staring at a place where people might actually live, leaving him totally stunned at the edge of the village. Urias stands there in silence, just staring up at the wooden building in front of him. He thinks about all the goblins and monsters he's dealt with, but this place feels way different and actually clean. Then he notices the scale of the entrance and gets hit by how massive it is, but a voice from above catches him off guard. A huge man stands over him asking if he's a guest, and Urias looks like he's seen a ghost. He's shaking a bit because the guy is just so big. But then it clicks for him as he realizes this is a cloud giant, a race he actually remembers studying back in his academy class. The giant looks down and mentions his security barrier should caught an intruder, then asks Urias who he is. So Urias decides to just be honest and tells him he's a human named Urias, even though he's a bit nervous about it. The giants are surprised to see a human, but then they notice something weird about his right arm, and the big guy stares him down, asking if he's actually carrying a Twilight sign. Urias is totally confused by the term Twilight person, thinking it's something he's never heard before and wondering if these giants know the truth about his arm. The giant stands right over him, and Urias just freezes up because the guy is so huge. He starts sweating, thinking this guy looks way more powerful than the others and probably runs the whole place, and the giant hums, acknowledging the Twilight thing before repeating Urias's name and introducing himself as Edgar, the chief of the village. Edgar tells him to follow along, so Urias walks behind him thinking the chief doesn't seem like a bad guy, even though he's still a bit wary since giants are technically demons. But the guy is so chill with humans that Urias doesn't feel any bad vibes at all. He looks around at the village buildings and realizes he doesn't really have a choice but to follow the chief's lead for now. They eventually sit down to talk, and Edgar says he finally gets what's going on with Urias's situation. Edgar mentions how impressive it is for a kid to survive outside the cities for a year, then explains that giants stay neutral, so they know a lot about human business. Then he drops a bombshell, saying another human visited 3 years ago with a red mark on his arm, just like the one Urias is carrying. Urias is visibly shaken and asks the chief if he actually knows what's up with the mark on his arm. Edgar explains it's the mark of a twilight person, which is basically proof that a human has adapted to that harsh environment, and Urias repeats the name in confusion. So Edgar clarifies that while the twilight is usually like poison to people, some rare exceptions can handle it just fine. He confirms that those rare cases are exactly what a twilight person is, leading into how monsters in that zone use a power called a twilight field, and twilight people are the only ones who can actually fight them. Urias takes a second to process this, and realizes it's probably the secret behind how his invisible blade skill worked. He tells the chief he understands and asks what happened to the person who visited 3 years ago, so Edgar tells him the guy stayed for a bit before leaving, but he mentioned the traveler left behind some books, which really catches Urias off guard. The chief watches him closely, noting that Urias has adjusted to the power pretty well, and he adds that Urias's level of adaptation is just like that guy from back then, or maybe even better. Urias just stands there looking completely stunned by the news. He asks what the twilight even is, since he's only heard about it in stories from a war a century and a half ago. But Edgar admits his people are just as clueless. The chief explains that nobody really knows what the twilight is, and its whole origin remains a total mystery, but he suddenly changes the subject. Edgar asks if he's planning on going back to the city, and Urias shouts that he obviously wants to go home right away. He explains that he's just been wandering around lost because he has no idea where they are, so Edgar tells him there's actually a map, which catches Urias totally off guard. The chief says he can have it, and Urias can't believe his luck. But then Edgar suggests they have a fight first, leaving Urias confused. Edgar clenches his fist and explains his tribe lives for battle, mentioning he even fought the guy who visited 3 years ago, though he lost that one. Edgar lays out the rules, saying it's going to be a one-on-one match where Urias has to use every skill he's got, and if he accepts the challenge, the chief promises to hand over the map, the book, and all the food he needs for his journey. Edgar stares him down and asks if he's in on the deal. Urias thinks it over, realizing that even though this is out of nowhere, the chief hasn't actually tried to hurt him this whole time, so he feels like he can trust him and finally gives him an answer, saying he understands the situation. He actually looks pretty hyped about it, saying he's been wanting to test his own limits anyway and gladly accepts the fight. The two of them head out and face off, standing a good distance apart. Edgar holds up his weapon and explains this isn't some fight to the death, so he's already made sure the blade is totally dull. Urias nods and says he'll follow those rules too, getting his own gear ready as the chief just smiles and tells him it's time to go. Edgar yells that he's coming and lunges forward to start the fight. Urias locks eyes with him, staying focused as he tries to track the giant's movement. The chief brings down a massive swing that's moving way faster than it looks. Urias notes the power is crazy, but the path is super direct, making it seem easy to dodge, but as he moves to get out of the way, he feels something shift in the air. The sword suddenly curves mid-swing and slams right into Urias's guard. He barely manages to hold it off, but the weight of the hit is definitely putting him through it. Urias can't believe the sword path just changed and realizes it's inertia control magic, something he never thought a cloud giant could do. Edgar recognizes Urias's weapon as a high-level materialized illusion, calling it impressive work for a twilight person, and decides it's time to actually get serious, so Urias starts breaking a sweat, realizing the real pressure is only just beginning. The two of them stay locked in a heavy power struggle, sparks flying everywhere as Urias realizes he can't keep this up forever and needs to find a way to finish things fast or he's in trouble. Just then, his sword gets knocked right out of his grip, leaving him completely wide open. Edgar yells that he's got him now and brings his blade down for what looks like the final blow, but he misses completely. Urias pulls a fast one, slipping right past the giant's guard and ending up behind him. Edgar's eyes go wide when he feels the cold steel of a blade pressed right against his throat. Urias stares him down, knowing his plan to bait the giant into an opening worked out exactly how he wanted. The chief closes his eyes and admits it was a solid move, officially calling it quits and giving Urias the win. Urias finally lets out a breath, looking totally drained while saying that he's actually the one who feels defeated. He admits he was pushing his absolute limits by the end, even though he knew Edgar wasn't even trying. Urias lets go of his sword hilt, looking at Edgar and wondering what the giant thought of that last move. Edgar tells him that either way, the win goes to Urias. He says he'll hand over the prize and suggests the kid head back to his hometown soon, but Urias just stands there looking completely stunned. He closes his eyes for a second, really feeling the weight of the moment. He speaks up and asks if it's okay if he actually stays in the village for a little while longer. As he stands his ground, he explains that since he's already there, he really wants to use the time to train and get better. He thinks back on the last year spent camping out in the wild, admitting there were plenty of times he was scared he wouldn't even wake up the next day. The kid looks Edgar right in the eye, saying he finally understands how tough the world is, so he wants to get as strong as he can to make sure he gets home in one piece. Edgar just starts cracking up. He's clearly loving the fire he sees in the kid's eye. The chief tells Urias he's got a great spirit, promising to give him his all as a training partner from now on, while Urias thanks him. After a long time training together, Urias finally gets ready to head out, thanking the giants for everything as Edgar tells him to stay safe out there on the road. Urias ends up staying in the Cloud Giant village for a full 6 months, but he's actually glad about it since all that time spent there made him way stronger. As he starts his journey, he looks back on everything, but there's still one thing on his mind that he can't quite figure out. He pulls out the book Edgar gave him before he left, holding it up to take a closer look at the gift from the chief. The pages are packed with info about demons and the Twilight world, but the writing is so messy and dense that he can barely make any sense of it. He thinks about how he should probably find someone in the city to help him read it, so he decides to just keep it safe until he gets back. The kid gets a little stressed out just looking at the pages, admitting to himself that all the technical stuff is way over his head for now. He looks out at the trees and thinks about the fact that he's finally going back to the city, even though it's been a long time since he's been around people. Urias isn't even sure if he has a place to go back to anymore, but he knows for sure that heading back is better than just wandering around the wild forever. He takes a deep breath and tells himself it's time to go home, finally setting off on the long trek back to civilization. Another 6 months pass, and the kid is looking pretty rough. He's covered in sweat and can't believe he still hasn't reached the city after all this time. Urias is still trekking through the woods, thinking about how it's been a full year since he left the giant village and he's just been wandering around. He tells himself it is what it is, but he really feels like he should have reached something by now. To make things worse, he hasn't run into any edible monsters like those tasty mushrooms or lizards for days, and he's starting to get seriously hungry. The kid is basically running on fumes at this point, admitting to himself that he's hit his absolute limit and can't go much further. He's covered in sweat and looks like he's about to pass out right there in the dirt, but then he catches a glimpse of something through the haze and wonders if he's seeing the shadow of a city or if his mind is just playing tricks on him. He looks closer and sees a massive stone wall with towers stretching across the horizon, and it hits him all at once. He loses it, shouting at the top of his lungs that it's actually the barrier city, standing right there in front of him. He stops walking and just stares at the giant fortress, taking in the fact that the long nightmare is finally over. His eyes start tearing up as he asks himself if he's really back where he belongs, and he throws his hands up in the air, cheering because he finally made it home. Urias realizes that as soon as he let his guard down and felt safe, his body just stopped working. He loses his balance and goes down hard, slamming into the ground, right outside the city walls. He's out cold, looking like he's been through hell, but then a female knight finds him lying there. Later on, back in safety, Urias finally starts to come around. He looks pretty rough, with dark circles under his eyes as he sits up in a bed. He's in a clean room that looks like a hospital or a clinic, and he sees two women standing there. One of them, a lady with glasses, asks if he's finally awake, before introducing herself as Elsa Amos. She gives him a friendly look and asks for his name, so he tells her he's Urias Curtis. He's still a bit dazed and asks if he's really in the barrier city, and Elsa says yes, letting him know he's officially made it to the 7th barrier city. Urias is completely caught off guard, asking if he's really in the 7th city since he realizes he's drifted way off course. Looking at the map, he's traveled a massive distance from the 3rd barrier city, but he figures it doesn't really matter as long as he's safe. For the moment, Elsa tells him that some academy students on a training mission found him passed out, and since his uniform from the 3rd city was a mess, they're currently getting it cleaned. While they wait, she explains they've already reached out to his old academy using communication magic to verify his identity, which makes Urias start to sweat a bit as the knight watches him closely. Elsa says they managed to find his photo on a list of missing persons, but there are some things about his case that just don't make any sense to her at all. She points out that he actually disappeared 2 years ago, and she wants to know exactly what he's been doing during that huge gap in time, leaving Urias feeling the pressure. He knows they're suspicious and wonders if they'd even believe the truth, but he decides being honest is probably his best bet, even if it's a lot to explain. His hand starts shaking and he hesitates, telling her there's something he needs to handle before they get into the detail, because he's actually about to collapse from hunger. He admits he's at his absolute limit and asks if they have anything he can eat, which breaks the tension. The knight calls out to a girl named Sherry to go grab some food, and she quickly answers from the other room. Urias finally gets his hands on some food and just starts housing a sandwich, loving every second of it. Elsa tells him he can have as much as he wants, but she quickly gets back to business, pointing out that he really was out in the twilight for 2 whole years. Urias looks pretty tense as he looks her in the eye and insists that everything he told her is the truth, even if it sounds crazy. Elsa looks him over, admitting that while the story is hard to buy, it's not exactly impossible, especially since she's seen the mark on him. She drops the interrogation for a second to ask what his plan is, since he's got a big choice to make. She asks if he's actually going back to the third city, or if he's even going back to school at all, which makes Urias go quiet. He looks down and grips his blanket, clearly thinking about how much his life has changed before finally speaking up. He tells her that his dream hasn't changed and he still wants to become a great mage, but the problem is he doesn't feel like he has a home to go back to anymore. He's just stuck. So Elsa makes him an offer that catches him off guard. She suggests he just stay right there and try to join the academy in the 7th barrier city instead. Elsa drops a major bomb and mentions she forgot to introduce herself. She's actually the principal of the academy here in the 7th city. She tells Urias she can handle all his transfer paperwork if he's interested, and the kid looks totally relieved, asking if she's serious because he's definitely down. But just then, Sherry pipes up from the side and yells that she's totally against the idea, calling Elsa mother while addressing her as the principal. Sherry looks Urias up and down with a huge amount of doubt, saying there is no way a scrawny, weak-looking kid like him survived out in the twilight for 2 whole years. She's not holding back at all, insisting to her mother that the kid is obviously just lying about his whole story. She even points out his looks, saying any guy who lets his hair get that long and messy is definitely a total weirdo she'll never trust, making Urias look pretty awkward. Elsa ignores the attitude and tells him she should introduce them properly, explaining that Sherry is her daughter and student, and the one who actually found him. Sherry just gives him a cold look and introduces herself as Sherry Amos, keeping things professional but still clearly annoyed. Elsa explains that the kid is in a really tough spot right now, and since he was already a magic student back home, she doesn't see any problem with taking him in. Sherry finally gives in and says she understands, so Elsa starts laying out the plan for how they're going to handle everything from here. Sherry lays down the law and challenges Urias to a one-on-one fight, saying if he wins, he's in, but if he loses, he has to pack his bags and go home right then and there. Urias looks like he just saw a ghost, completely worn out and stressed by the sudden ultimatum. It's pretty intense. Sherry turns to her mom and asks what she thinks of the plan, while Elsa just looks down with a drop of sweat, realizing her daughter isn't going to budge on this, so she finally gives in. Elsa sighs and says that if they're putting safety first, she'll allow the match to happen for now, leading her to turn the question over to the kid. She asks Urias what he thinks of the deal, but he just stands there looking like his soul is about to leave his body while Edgar watches from the sideline. The giant thinks to himself that this whole scene feels like a total rerun of something from a year ago, even though Urias is just wondering why every situation he's in ends with a duel. Sherry doesn't say a word, just staring him down with those sharp eyes and waiting for him to make a move. Urias starts thinking about his old life back in the third city, all the times Dan and the others treated him like trash, and he realizes there's no way he wants to go back to that, meaning he finally finds his voice. He looks down and tells her he understands the terms she's setting, and then he looks her straight in the face with a brand new fire in his eyes. He tells himself it's way better to start fresh and work hard here than go back home, so he officially accepts the challenge. The group heads out to the courtyard as the duel gets ready to start. Urias and Sherry stand across from each other with their swords drawn, while Elsa stands nearby to keep an eye on things and sets the ground rules, reminding them both that this is a strict one-on-one fight with no outside help. Elsa explains that it's a sword duel where a win counts if you can hold your blade to a vital spot, and though magic is allowed, she'll shut it down if it gets too dangerous. Urias just nods and says he gets it, so Sherry decides to drop a bombshell, casually mentioning she's actually an A-rank adventurer. Urias is totally floored and tells her how amazing that is, but then she asks him if he's 15 years old yet. Urias confirms his age, which leads to Sherry pointing out that they're the exact same age while she shifts into her combat stance. She looks him dead in the eye and asks if he really understands what being A-rank at 15 actually means for him right now. Elsa doesn't give them any more time to talk. She drops her hand and yells for them to start the match. Sherry moves like a total blur, lunging forward instantly, while thinking that her rank means there's no way he's winning this fight. Urias stands his ground with his sword ready. He's totally locked in while Sherry starts to realize that something is way off. Her eyes go wide as she sees how high his level actually is, but Urias stays completely calm. He isn't even breaking a sweat yet because he's already read her entire movement pattern. He thinks to himself that her stance and footwork gave everything away. He's so much stronger that he doesn't even need his secret skills to win. Sherry can't handle the gap in their power and shouts out for one more round. Urias is caught off guard by her persistence, but he just goes along with it, and agrees to keep going. They reset the match, but the result is exactly the same, so she immediately calls for another go. This keeps happening over and over. Sherry keeps charging in and Urias keeps shutting her down, yet she refuses to stop. By the time they're done, Sherry is slumped on the ground in total defeat. Turns out she lost 10 times in a row without winning once. Finally hitting her limit, Sherry admits that it's her loss and tells him she officially gives up. Sherry looks down, feeling a bit embarrassed about her behavior, and apologizes for acting so silly before admitting that Urias is actually way stronger than she thought. It's a total reality check for her, and Urias starts blushing and waving it off, saying it's really not that big of a deal because Elsa steps in with a big smile, telling them both that the matter is finally settled. She looks at Urias and officially welcomes him to the 7th Barrier City's Academy, announcing that they're bringing him on as an A-rank mage, which completely catches him off guard. He can't believe he's getting such a high rank, but Elsa points out that since he's stronger than Sherry, it's only fair. Urias just stammers that he has no complaints at all. Elsa tells him they'll wrap up the official paperwork another day and asks if there's anything else he needs before they finish up, leading Urias to look a little unsure. He pauses for a moment, clearly having one specific request on his mind. He nervously asks if it's okay for him to finally get a haircut. A little while later, everything is different for him. He's in a brand new city, wearing a fresh academy uniform and rocking a much cleaner hairstyle. And just like that, a whole new chapter of his life is officially starting. Urias stands in front of his new class and starts his introduction, explaining that he just transferred over from the 3rd Barrier City and goes on to tell everyone his name is Urias Curtis, finishing up by saying it's great to meet all of them. The whole room goes quiet as the other students just stare him down. Some look skeptical, while others seem pretty impressed by the new guy. The silence doesn't last long before one girl in the front row shoots her hand up, calling out that she has a question for him. She leans in with a look of pure curiosity and asks if the crazy rumors are true about him surviving out in the twilight for 2 years, but Urias just gives a nervous laugh and waves it off, telling her that's definitely not what happened, and he just moved here for some personal reason. Another girl with blonde hair chimes in right away, asking if the other story about him beating Sherry in a sword fight is actually true. He shuts that one down too, explaining that they just ran into each other while he was doing some paperwork and they never even had a match. So the girl realizes all the gossip was basically just talk. But then the big guy sitting nearby speaks up to say he's got a question of his own. He looks Urias dead in the eye with a serious expression and asks him straight up what his rank is as a mage. Urias looks pretty stressed out as he finally answers the question, telling the class that as of right now, he's actually an A-rank mage, which completely blows everyone's mind. The students just stare at him with their mouths hanging open, unable to believe a transfer student is that high level. The room turns into a total mess as kids start shouting and gossiping, saying there's no way he's serious, and that if he's really A-rank, then the rumors about him beating Sherry must be true. Urias starts waving his hands around, trying to tell them it was just a total accident and not a big deal. While the rest of the class is making a scene, one girl just sits there and gives him this incredibly intense, sharp look. Later on, Urias is walking down the hall with Elsa. She points out how he really got grilled by everyone on his first day, and he just gives a weak laugh. She mentions that transfer students don't really happen much around there, so he was bound to be the center of attention, but she tells him he's just going to have to do his best to deal with all the talk. Urias looks a bit tired as he tells her he gets it. Elsa gets serious for a second and reminds him that he has to keep the secret about his right arm hidden from everyone, otherwise it'll just cause a ton of trouble. Urias clenches his fist at his side and promises her that he knows exactly what's at stake. Right before the transfer is official, Urias looks a bit surprised and asks if he really has to get a health checkup, which Elsa confirms, saying that while most students just get the basic version, they need to take a good look at his right arm specifically. Urias doesn't mind at all and tells her it's fine, mostly because he's been dying to know what's actually happening to his body anyway. Elsa just gives him a quiet nod. She looks pretty serious as they get ready to go over the result. She decides to just get straight to the point and tells him they diagnosed his condition as a completely new type of disease, and she finally reveals the name of it. She calls it Twilight Syndrome, while looking him right in the eye. Urias goes totally pale when she tells him he's already at level 5, or maybe even past that point. She explains the disease was only discovered recently and is definitely toxic. The crazy part is most people would be dead at his level, yet he's survived it for 2 years. Elsa then brings up the Twilight Field the Cloud Giant mentioned, telling him they're currently running their own research on it at the Academy, and even though the terms are a bit different, she says they found references to this whole thing in some old books. Urias starts to wonder if his situation is as crazy as it sounds. Elsa looks him right in the eye and confirms it's exactly like that. It all comes down to the S-rank anti-mages, the top tier of protectors who stand at the very peak. peak. Elsa explains that only S ranks are really equipped to handle the Twilight Field, though she mentions A ranks can at least put up a fight. She admits she doesn't know what that person told the Cloud Giants back at their village, but none of that really matters compared to the bottom line, which is that Urias is essentially on the same level as an S-rank anti-mage. She tells him straight out that he's an incredibly valuable asset now. Urias just stands there in total silence. He's staring at the floor, trying to wrap his head around being compared to the strongest mages alive. He starts questioning what he's even become at this point, but then he realizes there's no use overthinking it anymore, since at least people are actually researching his condition now. It's a huge relief for him compared to when his body was just one big mystery. Moving on, Elsa mentions one more thing regarding his living situation. It turns out the student dorms are completely full, so she's setting him up in an old staff shack for the time being. Urias doesn't mind at all. He just laughs and says that having a roof and a shower feels like heaven compared to where he's been. Elsa tells Urias he's a reliable guy and asks him to look after Sherry while he's around. Urias gives her a quick okay and says goodbye as he heads out, but he doesn't realize Nora is actually hiding behind a wall nearby. She's staring him down with a super serious look, making him feel pretty uneasy, and then she just snaps. She pops out from the corner looking totally flustered and stomps right up to him, catching him completely off guard as she looks him in the eye and tells him he needs to come with her right now. She seems pretty worked up about something, so the two of them head over to a quieter spot near an academy tower. Once they settle down, Nora pulls out some food and tells Urias to take it. Urias is pretty shocked by the gesture. He just stares at the sandwiches and asks what's going on. Nora blushes and looks away, saying she's just giving them to him. She mentions he probably forgot his lunch and likely has nobody to eat with anyway, which hits Urias right in the feels. He's so happy about the food and the company that he starts tearing up while thanking her, and while he starts eating, Nora's tone shifts. She asks if it's okay to talk about the Twilight Field, and Urias just tells her it's fine with him. Nora looks at Urias with a serious expression and asks how he managed to survive out there, specifically what he did for food. Urias doesn't miss a beat while eating and tells her he just ate monsters since there wasn't any other choice, and he adds that frogs, snakes, and spiders actually tasted pretty good once he got used to it. Though Nora looks completely grossed out. He holds up his sandwich with a bright smile, saying that normal food like this really is the best thing ever. Nora just stares at him in silence, looking a bit overwhelmed by how casual he is about everything. She notes that if he's that strong, food must be his only worry, but Urias clarifies he only got this strong because of the Twilight Field. Nora can't believe it and says no way, but Urias just blushes a bit and promises her it's the truth, telling her he used to be a total failure at the bottom of E rank, so Nora asks why he even go to a place like that. Urias goes quiet for a moment, just looking off into the distance, until Nora breaks the silence by mentioning the academy has classes where students have to form parties for hunting. Nora listens quietly as the story continues, nodding along while Urias mentions a time their leader took them way too deep into a dangerous zone. Urias looks down, remembering how they ran into way more enemies than anyone expected, and then Nora gets this worried look on her face. She asks him if he's actually serious about what happened next. He just gives a simple confirmation, telling her that yeah, the truth is he was basically used his bait. The party made him draw all the aggro and then locked him behind a magic barrier. He figured it would only last a few days, so Urias realized he couldn't just sit around in the middle of a monster zone forever, leaving him with no choice but to start heading further out. He laughs a bit while admitting he ended up getting totally lost, which is why he never made it back to the city. Nora is completely floored by how messed up that is. She says it's way too cruel to trap him like that when the barrier could have saved him. Urias just stays calm, explaining that leaving him behind was probably the easiest way for the rest of them to survive, while Nora realizes he's right. She looks at him with a sad expression and asks if he doesn't feel any bitterness at all about being betrayed like that. Urias thinks about it for a second and says it's not like he doesn't feel anything at all, but while he was wandering through that scary wasteland, he was so focused on just surviving that the betrayal stopped mattering. So Nora sits there in silence for a bit before telling him she finally gets where his strength comes from. She mentions how his resolve is just on a totally different level, which makes Urias feel pretty awkward. Nora looks at the falling leaves and starts to say she isn't used to asking for favors, but then she gets all red in the face and straight up asks Urias if he'll train her. The kid is totally surprised by the request, but Nora explains she really wants to get stronger too, leaving the girl waiting there looking super nervous while she waits for him to give her an answer. Urias just smiles and tells her he's happy to help if she's really okay with him being the one to do it. Nora's eyes light up immediately as she asks him if he's actually being serious about it. Nora's face lights up with a huge smile as she tells him she's so relieved since she'd been wanting to ask him that all day. Urias turns his head and blushes like crazy, stammering out a quiet agreement and telling her he's down to help whenever she needs. The kid takes a second to process everything, thinking about how not too long ago He never would have seen his life turning out like this. Nora smiles at him and offers a sincere thank you, feeling like it's been forever since she was actually able to be this happy. She tells him she's looking forward to it, while Urias can't help but think about how surprisingly bright her smile really is. As the leaves drift by, he feels a genuine sense of happiness and realizes he really wants to hold on to these moments. It's a complete 180 from his old life. Now he's just focused on making sure this new start stays exactly the way it is. Fast forward a few days, and Urias is standing outside the academy in his uniform, letting out a long sigh after a busy afternoon. He realizes he spent so much time on self-study and training Sherry that the day just flew by, and now he's got to figure out dinner. He stands there in the quiet evening, just taking a moment to himself before heading back. Urias walks down the path alone, enjoying the quiet as the sun starts to go down. Just a normal walk until he gets lost in his own thoughts for a second, totally relaxed and not expecting anything to happen. Suddenly, he feels a chill and whips his head around. Someone is definitely watching him from the shadows, making him wonder if a monster somehow snuck past the city walls. But the hostile vibe he's picking up feels different. He stops and realizes it's not a monster at all, narrowing his eyes as he tries to pinpoint exactly where this human bloodlust is coming from. It's heavy, and you can tell whoever is hiding nearby is a total pro. He catches a glimpse of a familiar mark and realizes this situation is way more dangerous than he thought, and it reminds him exactly of the Twilight group. The realization hitting him just as a voice calls out. A huge shadow towers over him as a stranger admits he thought about an ambush, but decided that sneaking around just isn't his style. The big guy grins with a massive sword on his shoulder, telling Urias they're doing this head-on. The scruffy guy just stands there with a big grin, looking right at him. He calls Urias by name, which sends a chill down the kid's spine and makes him break into a cold sweat because the big guy doesn't waste any time. He shouts that he's coming straight for him, giving Urias just enough time to reach for his blade as the fight officially kicks off and Urias locks in, his eyes wide and focused on every single movement. The stranger says his name again, almost like he's mocking him while he closes the gap, so Urias glares back with everything he's got. He demands to know who the hell this guy is, but he doesn't get a straight answer since the swordsman just keeps that creepy smile plastered on his face. He tells Urias that if he had managed to stay alive for just a few more seconds, things might have been different. Then he yells out that he's going to show him how it's done. He lunges forward and puts his whole weight into a massive swing that looks like it could split the ground open, and the speed is insane. The giant sword whistles through the air as Urias tries to move. He's forced to react purely on instinct just to keep his head on his shoulders while he somehow manages to get his own sword up in time to catch the blow. They're standing face to face now, the air heavy with the weight of their clashing steel, and the big guy actually looks surprised for a second. He lets out a laugh and admits the kid is doing a lot better than he expected. But then his vibe gets even darker as he says they should keep playing a while longer. Urias feels the pressure mounting and realizes he's in way over his head with this guy. Gil leans into a massive swing, yelling that he's taking him down right now. Urias can barely keep up, realizing this guy is on a completely different level of strength. But just as things look bad, Claudia steps in, letting out a soft breath that sends a trail of ice crystals floating through the air, and suddenly Gil's entire arm and sword are locked in a thick block of ice. He stops dead in his track, looking completely caught off guard by the intervention since Urias just stares with his eyes wide, trying to process how the fight ended so fast. Gil looks over at the newcomer, realizing the party is over, so Claudia walks right into the middle of them. She tells them both that's enough for now, making it clear the fight is finished while she looks at Gil with a pretty annoyed face. She asks him if he didn't say this was just supposed to be a surprise meeting instead of a full-blown battle. Then Gil just rubs the back of his head and gives a little grin. He apologizes and admits he just really wanted to see what the kid was made of in a real fight, and decides he's seen enough to give him a pass. Urias stands there shaking, finally finding his voice to ask who these people even are. Gil and Claudia look at each other, realizing they skipped the basics, so the swordsman drops his guard and smiles. He says sorry for the crazy entrance and introduces himself as Gil, and then the woman beside him keeps it short and sweet. She looks at Urias and tells him her name is Claudia. Gil shrugs it off, saying Urias probably hasn't heard of them since they aren't exactly famous, while he drops the bomb that both he and Claudia are actually S-rank mages. Urias can't believe it, and then Gil keeps going, telling the kid that's why he's bringing him to see someone important. Urias is totally lost, but it gets crazier when Gil says he wants him to meet Silas, the guy who's ranked #1 among all S-rankers. The kid just stands there with his mouth open, completely frozen by the news. Urias finally snaps out of it and tells them to wait a second, saying this is all way too much to take in at once. So Gil looks actually surprised, asking if he was being too sudden with all the life-changing info. Claudia sighs and tells Urias she's sorry, saying he should just ignore the old guy since he's not very smart. Gil looks pretty annoyed in the back, while she promises to explain everything the right way, starting with the fact that they already know every single detail about his past and where he came from. Urias looks worried, especially when she apologizes and admits they've actually been watching his every move since the moment he arrived in the city. Claudia explains they even secretly watched his sword duel against Sherry and Ama, which led all the S-rank mages to reach a final conclusion about him. She says that's why they want him to meet Silas to talk things over, leaving Urias standing there sweating since he feels like things are moving way too fast for him to even process. He thinks to himself that he basically gets the situation now, and it makes sense they'd monitor him. But still, Silas is the top dog of all 12 S-rank mages. He's incredibly famous, but turns out nobody actually knows what he looks like. The guy is known as the hero of Twilight and the strongest person alive. Urias just can't figure out why a legend like that would want anything with him. They eventually stop in front of a small house, and Claudia points it out, saying Silas is right inside. Urias just stands there looking pretty nervous, realizing he's just gone along with everything they'd told him so far. Gil and Claudia give him a quick wave and tell him to take his time before they take off. Claudia gives a quick wave as she heads out, leaving Urias totally stressed about being left there all by himself. He can't believe this is happening, but then he hears the door click open and sees a figure standing inside. A woman with glasses and short hair looks up with a smile and asks if he's Urias. The kid nervously says yes, and she just tells him it's all good and to come on inside the house. As she moves around the kitchen, she apologizes for the wait and tells him to grab a seat while she gets some tea ready. So Urias sits there looking pretty confused before finally asking where Silas actually is. The woman just smiles and introduces herself as Silas, saying it's nice to finally meet him. Urias completely loses it, staring at her with wide eyes because he can't wrap his head around her being the legend. Silas asks if he's surprised, and he admits he totally is since he expected the strongest mage to look way more intimidating. She just laughs and says her friends tell her that all the time, even though she's the one in charge. Urias stares at the woman, wondering if she's really the famous Silas because she just looks like a totally normal person. Silas mumbles about putting way too much sugar in her tea, making it even harder for the kid to believe who she is. She decides to introduce herself properly this time, telling him she's Silas, the rank 1 S-rank anti-magic mage. Urias reaches out to shake her hand and says he's looking forward to working with her. But as soon as their hands meet, a massive wave of energy suddenly explodes out of nowhere between them. The kid's eyes go wide and he starts breaking a sweat from the sheer pressure of it all. He can't believe the amount of magic power he's feeling just from a simple handshake. The strength coming from her palm is completely overwhelming, like nothing he's ever felt before, and it's even more obvious how powerful she is because she isn't showing a single bit of hostility. There's no doubt in his mind now that this woman is exactly who she says she is. Silas apologizes for the scare, but says it was necessary to prove she wasn't lying about her identity. Looking him right in the eye, she decides it's time to get straight to the point and tells Urias flat out that she wants him to become an S-rank anti-magic mage. The kid just stands there in silence, his mind completely blank from the shock. Silas continues, saying she's already seen enough to know he has the talent to reach that level. Urias looks totally stressed out, his face covered in sweat as he tries to process it all. Seeing his reaction, Silas asks him if he actually hates the idea of moving up that high. He quickly tells her it's not like that, but everything is just happening way too fast. Urias says his head is spinning, which just makes Silas laugh while calling him a tough case. She looks down at her tea and explains that he's a massive exception they simply can't ignore. Silas explains that she really wants to build a good relationship with him. Urias just stares back in total silence, looking completely overwhelmed, and Silas thinks it's simple. If a kid like him ever became an enemy of humanity, it'd be a disaster, so she needs to bring him in as an ally now because managing a massive exception like him is just common sense. Urias looks down at the floor, repeating the words S-rank anti-magic mage over and over in his head, while he looks up for a second, totally lost in his own world and thinking about how he always dreamed of being a great mage. But now that the chance is right in front of him, it feels more like he's just watching a dream happen. He starts to wonder if maybe he's actually just been running away from reality the whole time. Silas asks if that's what's going through his head right now, catching him off guard as she calmly takes another sip of her tea, giving him space to think. So Urias clenches his fist tight and admits that for right now, he just doesn't have any confidence. Silas tells him that regardless of what he's feeling deep down, she really thinks it's for the best if he stays close to an S-rank mage like her. She shows him the weird, dark marks covering her arm and explains the reason is because most of the top mages are actually just like him. The words Twilight Syndrome hit Urias like a truck, and he just stares at her in total disbelief. Silas goes on to say that almost all S-rank mages are dealing with this condition, and even though the marks show up differently on everyone, they're working on a cure and expect to know more soon. She mentions there's actually another side to this too, explaining that the royal family is busy making the rounds to inspect every city. Since this is their last stop before heading back to the first barrier city, they need some extra guards for the trip, and they've decided to recruit a few students to help out and gain some experience. She looks right at him and says they're actually recommending him for the spot, then asks him what he thinks about the offer. Urias just stands there, looking serious while he thinks. It turns out humanity hasn't really changed one bit since the day they lost the Great Magic War. Just trying to keep things the same for the sake of comfort is really just a slow way of moving backward. Silas tells Urias it's about time they started moving forward, and that right now is the moment to do it. She looks him in the eye and says it's finally time for them to bring light back to the world. Urias just stares back at her, completely stunned by what she's saying. He thinks about how she's totally right, and starts wondering if this is the kind of thing his father was always searching for. Realizing that this mission is exactly what he's meant to do, he tells her he gets it, though he admits he doesn't really have any confidence in himself yet. Still, Urias stands tall and addresses her as an S-rank maid, telling her he's going to accept the job, even though he's clearly a bit nervous about taking on such a huge responsibility. Silas mentions that just speaking for herself, she really wants to have at least one strong partner by her side, so she tells him that's the main reason she wants to put her faith in him. Silas thanks him and says he's more than welcome to join up, and she looks him right in the eye, telling him she really wants him to become an S-rank anti-magic maid. Urias thinks about his arm and how they're all pretty much in the same boat with their condition, so he looks at her and says he'll officially take the job as an S-rank mage. The next day, Urias is looking pretty worn out as he thinks back to meeting Silas and agreeing to join her. He really tried to keep his cool and think things through once he got back to his room, but it's not working at all. He just drops his head onto the desk, totally panicking over the fact that he actually agreed to be an S-rank mage. Just as he's losing it, someone calls out his name, making him look up to see a girl standing there with a heavy bag. She tells him here's the stuff and explains she brought the books he asked for a while back. Urias sits up at his desk and thanks her for the help, and he realizes he needs to stop stressing and just focus on something else for a bit. Urias starts flipping through the stack of books Sherry brought over, and Sherry asks if he's seriously going to summarize all that info into a notebook. He says yeah, so she asks if it's for some kind of assignment he has to hand in, but he tells her no, it's just that he's 2 years behind everyone else. He tells her he really needs to catch up on his studies, explaining that he wants to cram in as much knowledge as possible. He thinks it'll give him a better chance of surviving in the long run, and Sherry just stares at him for a second, looking pretty impressed by how hard he's working. She tells him that once he hits a good stopping point, they should get back to their special training for the day. Urias looks a little flustered but agrees to keep going with her. But then another girl starts teasing Sherry, asking if she's going on another after-school date with Urias. Sherry loses it and yells that it's strictly combat training, but the girl isn't buying it and says she wants to join in too, trying to get Keith to agree with her. Keith just lets out a big sigh, acting like he's over the whole thing as he asks if that's even going to make them any stronger. The girl points out that even with all that's going on, Sophia and Keith are basically right on the edge of hitting A rank, and Sophia casually mentions that she actually already passed the rank up exam. Keith follows up by saying he's just waiting for the official word to reach him, which leads the girl to ask if they've heard the big news about the school picking students to guard the royal family. She tells them it's definitely not just a rumor this time, so Dan starts acting cocky, saying he's a lock to get picked for the squad. The girl laughs and says she wants to go too, mostly because she's dying for a chance to see the other cities, but Urias has to remind her that they aren't going on some vacation. She just tells him that if they're going to do it, they might as well try to enjoy the trip. The scene shifts to the academy grounds where the sun is hitting the stone walls of the main building. Sherry is out in the courtyard with a practice sword, swinging it with a super serious look on her face. She and Urias are going at it, their blades clashing as they move across the grass in a fast-paced sparring match. Urias stops to give her some advice, telling her she needs to watch her breathing. He says the trick is to only put all her power into the swing at the very last second. Sherry is totally wiped and covered in sweat, but she lets out a determined yell and jumps back into the fight. Sherry's boot slams into the dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust as she pushes off. She lunges at Urias with everything she's got, but he stays light on his feet and tracks her every move. Urias points out that her step is still a little shallow, though he makes sure to tell her she's doing a great job, specifically with how she's handling her physical buffs and movement. Sherry stops to catch her breath, looking completely wiped and blushing from the effort, and tells him his skill level is the thing that's actually insane. She admits that the more they train together, the more she realizes they're just fundamentally on different levels. But Urias just smiles and tells her that the fact she can even see the gap between them says a lot about her own progress. He explains that being able to accurately judge how strong someone is a sign of strength itself, proving that she's definitely getting better. Sherry takes the compliment to heart, looking at him with a quiet smile as she thanks him. Urias looks up at the sky and suggests they call it a day and head back before the rain starts, which Sherry is totally down for. Just as they're about to leave, she gets a bit shy and asks if she can use the bath in his room today. Urias is completely caught off guard by the suggestion. His face turns red as he tries to process what Sherry just asked. Sherry quickly explains that the bath in the girls' dorm is being repaired right now. It should be fixed by tomorrow, so everyone else is just waiting, but she's covered in sweat from their training session and says she just can't deal with staying like this until morning. Urias looks away, rubbing his neck, and tells her he doesn't really mind letting her use it if that's the situation. Sherry gets all defensive and yells at him to not have any weird thoughts since she's just there for the water. Urias snaps back that he already knows and won't. Just then, Urias feels the first few drops of rain and says they should probably hurry back before it starts pouring. But as they walk, he gets this awkward look on his face and mentions that lending the bath is fine, but there's a bit of a problem. Sherry just looks at him like she has no idea what he's talking about. Once they get to the room, he explains the bath was added as an afterthought and wasn't there originally. The big issue is that there are no walls around it, just a thin shower curtain. The two of them stand there in an incredibly awkward silence, both of them blushing like crazy as they realize how little privacy she's actually going to have. Urias is so red he suggests just waiting outside while she's in there, but Sherry reminds him it's already pouring out. He looks out the window and realizes she's right. There's no way he can stand out in that mess. Sherry tells him not to feel bad about the situation since she was the one who asked for the favor. She says it'll be totally fine if he just keeps his back turned and faces the wall the whole time. Urias just nods and agrees, looking like he's about to have a heart attack from the stress of it all. He hears her finally step into the water, and just the sound of it makes him start to lose it. He stands there with his eyes wide, thinking about how his night went from normal to completely insane. He sits in his chair facing the opposite direction, but all he can focus on is the fact that his classmate is right behind him. A small splash from the tub hits his ears and he starts sweating, telling himself he's got to stop thinking about it. The splashing sounds keep coming, and Urias just shuts his eyes tight, desperately trying to keep his brain from wandering. Urias is still a nervous wreck, breathing heavy and sweating, while he desperately tells himself to think about anything else, just to get his mind off the situation. He starts thinking back to when he met the S-rank mage Scylla, along with Gil and Claudia, remembering how Gil actually apologized for trying to test them with a surprise fight. The memory of that insane mana still hits him hard. He realized back then he was standing in front of a legit royal guard and a top-tier S-rank mage. Sherry suddenly calls his name from the bath and Urias nearly jumps out of his skin. He shouts back asking what she needs, barely keeping himself from turning around. She ignores his panic and asks what he thinks about the rumor that they're picking students to join the royal guard. Urias just stammers out a vague answer. He tries to be supportive and tells her he's pretty sure she'll be the one they end up choosing for the spot. But Sherry gets quiet, looking down at the water as she says she really wants to be picked for her own sake. Urias just stares ahead, surprised to hear her sounding so serious about it. She explains that because her mom is the principal of the academy, everyone has been watching her since her first day. It's always been a mix of people expecting too much or just being jealous, even though she feels like she's just a normal kid with no real talent. Sherry keeps talking about her past, mentioning how she even had to deal with people being total jerks to her. She admits she absolutely hated the idea of losing just because of those rumors and expectations, and so she worked her tail off until she finally became an A rank faster than anyone else in her entire year. She looks up with this determined look, saying she just wants to be strong enough so she never loses to anyone. Urias just watches her, a small smile growing on his face as he hears how much she's been through. He stays quiet for a second before finally speaking up and calling out her name. He tells her he wanted her to be the one to hear this, mainly because he felt like he should be honest. So Sherry turns her head slightly, sounding a bit curious as she asks him what's on his mind. He lays it all out for her, explaining that after everything that's happened lately, he actually ended up becoming an S-rank mage. Sherry just stands there with her mouth open, totally shocked by the news as she tells him how amazing that is. Sherry looks happy and says the news is so amazing she can't even find the right words, but she makes sure to congratulate him properly. Urias thanks her for being so nice, though he admits he's actually feeling pretty conflicted about his new status. Sherry asks him why he feels that way, and Urias just looks down, saying the whole thing doesn't even feel real to him yet. He thinks back to 2 years ago when he was just a kid who looked up to mages, back when he was just doing whatever he could to survive in the twilight. Now he's back and suddenly he's jumping from A rank to S rank. It's all happening way too fast. And there's another reason he's worried, because Urias admits he never really wanted to stand out or be famous. And as Sherry listens with a worried look, he tells her he wants her to see something. Reaching up and pulling back his sleeve to show her his right arm, Sherry just stands there looking completely shocked at the dark mark. It turns out it's a level 5 case of Twilight Syndrome, and Urias tells her his arm has actually been like this for 2 years. He explains that while the Twilight usually just poisons people, most S-rank mages have this syndrome, though he somehow got his power directly from it. Urias continues explaining his situation, saying that because of everything that's happened, he feels like he might not even be a normal human being anymore. He looks down, sweating and clearly stressed, admitting that even if he's reached S-rank with this power, it doesn't change how he feels. He's still terrified that people will just betray him and throw him away again like they did before. Just then, a loud splashing sound cuts him off, and Urias looks over, totally confused by what's happening. He hears more thumping sounds coming from nearby, and he's just standing there trying to figure out what the noise is until he looks up and sees something that makes his face turn bright red. Sherry is standing right there, completely losing it and yelling at him to stop saying such stupid things. Everything happens in a blur of movement and shock. Urias lets out a huge scream and flips straight backward out of his chair, completely losing his cool. Sherry gets right in his face, blushing hard while she tells him that his power isn't something to be afraid of. Urias is completely caught off guard, sweating and stuttering as he tries to process what she's even saying until she takes a step closer, explaining that when she calls him strong, she isn't just talking about his ability to fight. She tells him it's more about his sheer will to keep surviving through everything, and that kind of strength is something she truly respects. Sherry keeps going, telling him that, in her eyes, having that kind of heart is what really makes someone a human being. Sherry looks at him with total sincerity, saying that if he has the courage to face his own pain, and if he can still show kindness to the people around him despite everything he's been through, then he's definitely a great person, no matter what anyone else thinks. And she finishes by asking him to please stop being so scared of people, hoping her words finally reach him. Sherry looks back at him with watery eyes, finally whispering a quiet thank you as Urias just breaks down, letting the tears fall while he processes everything she just said. He thinks about how happy he is right now, thanking Sherry in his head because he's so glad he actually came back to this place. This was the one thing he always wanted someone to tell him, and Sherry gives him a warm, gentle smile before calling out his name. She tells him she knows this might sound a little weird to say out loud, but she honestly feels like he's going to be the light that eventually cuts through all this darkness. She laughs a bit awkwardly after that, admitting that getting all deep like that was actually pretty embarrassing, until Urias points out that if they're talking about embarrassing stuff, they've got a bigger problem, making Sherry realize exactly where they are right now, leaving her blushing hard as she tries to find a way to end the conversation. Sherry points away and tells Urias to get back in the bath and keep his eyes to himself, making him blush as he quickly agrees. Later on, he clenches his fist and realizes he's finally ready for what's coming, because he's decided to be the light that actually cuts through all this darkness. Looking at the academy, he tells himself again that he's going to be that light, and standing outside with the other students, he promises himself that there's no more room for doubt or hesitating anymore. Sherry suddenly shows up and says good morning, which totally catches him off guard and makes him jump. He tries to act normal, but immediately starts sweating, barely managing to tell her good morning back while he freaks out. Sherry's blushing too, admitting she still has those images of him stuck in her head from yesterday, so the two of them start whispering apologies to each other for the awkwardness until Sophia shows up and says hello, leaving the two of them to greet Sophia back, though she can definitely tell something weird is going on between them. Sophia leans in with a smirk and asks the two of them if anything happened last night, which immediately sends Urias and Sherry into a total panic. They both start stuttering and making excuses, with Urias acting confused while Sherry insists they didn't do a single thing. Sophia just watches them, not buying it at all. She whispers to Sherry that she wants to hear all the details about her first time later on, making Sherry snap and tell her she's being a total idiot since nothing happened. Sophia is about to keep the teasing going when she hears something whistling through the air right behind her. A wooden practice sword comes flying out of nowhere and slams into the ground right at her feet, nearly taking her out and making her jump back. She loses her cool and starts yelling about what the hell is going on, just as a voice from the side calls out to apologize for the close call. It turns out to be Keith, who's standing there holding another practice sword looking a bit tired. Sophia demands to know what he's doing this early, and he just tells her he's busy with his morning training. He explains that he's putting in the extra work because he wants to be ready for the upcoming Royal Guard selection, and as he stands there covered in sweat, he says his goal is to hit A rank just like Sophia, so he's going to push himself to the absolute limit. Sophia looks at him and actually seems impressed for once, telling him he's doing a pretty good job sticking to his goals. Keith waves his hand and says he won't be late for class, telling the group he'll catch them later. Sophia watches him go and mentions he's really giving it his all, while Sherry just smiles and agrees. Urias stands there looking pretty stressed, thinking back to when Silas told him he was rooting for him and wondering what's actually coming his way. The school hallway is buzzing with energy as a bunch of students crowd around a new notice on the bulletin board. The announcement lists Sherry for the Royal Guard selection, but then it says it's down to either Urias or Keith for the final spot, making Sophia totally lose it in shock. Urias and Sherry both look completely stunned as they read that there will be 2 or more people chosen in total. Elsa shows up and notes they've seen the news, so Urias immediately turns to her and asks what the hell is going on with this list. She just stays calm and says the board is pretty clear, but she offers to explain everything to them while they head out. As they start walking down a long hallway, Elsa tells them that for this specific guard job, they decided to pick 1 guy and 1 girl. She confirms that Sherry was the obvious pick for the girls since she's at the top of the class, and then she starts to explain the situation with the guys. Elsa explains that after a bunch of meetings between the school and the royals, the group ended up split on who to pick. Some wanted Urias for the job, but others were pushing for Keith, and since they couldn't reach a final decision, they figured the best move was to just see who's actually better, even by a little bit. She tells them they're going to have the 2 guys face off and just pick the winner. The method is up to them, but a normal mock battle is probably the easiest way to settle it. Silas suddenly shows up and tells Urias he's sorry things had to go down this way, leaving the kid totally caught off guard by his presence. Sophia can't believe her eyes and shouts his name, but Silas just gives them a casual hello like it's no big deal. Urias tries to act natural and says hey back, while Sophia is basically losing it in the background, asking if that's really the famous Silas standing right there. Silas breaks it down and says Elsa was right about the officials not being able to agree on a candidate. It turns out there are a lot of different factions and royal interests involved, which makes things complicated. He mentions that to keep everyone happy and keep up appearances, they had to go with this competition, even though the whole situation is honestly just a giant headache. He finishes up by saying he has to head out and break the news to the other guy, Keith, immediately after they're done talking. Keith is already getting into the zone. He's seen holding his sword and looking pretty stressed as he prepares for the fight. Silas explains that the royals changed their plans and are leaving earlier than expected. He says he knows it's sudden, but the match has to happen this afternoon, unless they have a conflict. But Urias doesn't hesitate for a second. He looks Silas right in the eye and tells him that fighting today isn't a problem at all. The kid clenches his fist with everything he's got, telling the adults he's ready and asking for the chance to prove himself. And seeing that fire in his eyes actually makes Elsa crack a small smile. Silas says he gets it and tells Urias to head over to the training grounds behind the school once his classes are finished. He wraps things up by saying that's all for now, leaving the 2 students alone as the officials head out to finish the prep work. Sophia stands there for a moment, just looking at Urias with a pretty worried expression on her face. She finally speaks up and mentions how this whole thing has turned into a massive situation for everyone involved, especially Urias, who just looks down and quietly agrees with her as the weight of it all starts to sink in. He realizes that if he hadn't transferred to this academy, Keith would have been the obvious choice from the start, and Sophia says Keith is probably thinking the exact same thing. Sophia just looks at him, sounding pretty worried as she calls out his name, but Urias clenches his fist tight, saying this is exactly why he can't back down. He looks straight ahead, telling her he needs to match Keith's intensity with everything he's got, thinking about how he used to feel small or hold himself back. But that's over now. He says he's already made up his mind to become an S-rank mage, so he's done with doubting himself. The 2 of them face off in the school courtyard, wooden swords gripped and ready to go. Elsa lays out the rules, saying it's a one-on-one match where she'll decide the winner based on who gives up or her own call, adding that while they're using wooden swords, magic is totally allowed, so they shouldn't hold back. Keith takes a breath and admits this whole situation turned out a lot weirder than he expected, but he stares Urias down and tells him he better bring his absolute best if he wants to win this. Urias looks Keith right in the eyes and agrees, telling him it's time they both finally start taking this match seriously. Elsa gives the signal to start, and Keith immediately charges in while chanting a spell, yelling that he's coming for him. Huge slabs of earth suddenly burst out of the ground, catching Urias totally off guard as they create a massive barrier between them. Urias stares at the rising dirt, trying to process if Keith is actually using Earth-style magic to change the battlefield. But then he spots Keith moving through the dust clouds, already swinging his wooden sword down for a strike. Urias reacts just in time to block the heavy blow, the impact of their swords sending sparks flying through the air. He realizes what's happening and tells himself Keith is using these walls as a screen to hide his movements and launch sneak attack, noticing that Keith is also using physical magic to beef up his strength, making every swing hit way harder than a normal student's. The dust starts to settle as another light flashes from behind the wall, but Urias isn't even worried, because he can still feel exactly where Keith is, saying that trying to hide your presence doesn't really work against him. The ground erupts into a massive cloud of dust as Keith's heavy attack slams down. Keith's eyes go wide when he realizes he missed, while Urias is already moving through the smoke. Urias stays low to the ground, heaping his sword ready for a quick counter, but Keith isn't done yet, yelling out that his magic is about more than just making a wall. He explains his earth wall is actually a weapon powered by mana for both attacking and defending, and it's not going down easily. Keith charges forward with everything he's got, shouting that he's going to crush Urias right now. Urias watches him come, thinking Keith is actually pretty impressive and has a really focused fighting style, but he says he's taking this match seriously too, and lets out a massive swing of his sword. The stone walls that look so tough get sliced into tiny pieces in an instant, leaving Urias standing there totally calm while the leftover rocks just fall around him. Urias finishes his massive upward swing, and the heavy stone wall just shatters into tiny pieces. Keith stands there with his mouth open, totally shocked by what happened while Urias stays calm. Urias looks at him and mentions how Keith's magic was actually pretty tough since it used so much mana, so he had to bet everything on speed to close the distance, and Keith realizes Urias wasn't just attacking blindly, but was actually looking for a way to create an opening in his guard. He closes his eyes and sweats, thinking to himself that Urias is way more than he expected. The fight is clearly over, so Keith just stands there and admits that he lost the match. Off to the side, Elsa watches the whole thing go down from the academy grounds. Keith asks if that sword is part of his special ability, and Urias says yeah, he actually got it while he was out in the twilight. He explains that while it's made for monsters, it also works against magic itself as long as there's mana in it, which is how he sliced the wall. Keith just stares at him and calls it a total cheat, telling Urias not to act like it's some simple thing. Keith just closes his eyes and shrugs it off, telling Urias to go out there and do his best, which makes Urias give a huge smile as he thanks him and says he definitely will. As Keith walks away, he shouts back that he's gonna train way harder for the next time they cross paths. Elsa walks up and mentions that Urias has some pretty good friends, and he just thanks her while trying to catch his breath. She looks at him seriously and says she's officially counting on him for this Royal Guard mission, explaining that while the schedule isn't final, they're planning to hit other cities for supplies, including his old home in the third barrier city. She says she'll fill him in on the details later and heads off, leaving Urias standing there alone, just quietly repeating the name of his hometown to himself. He clenches his fist tight as the memories start to come back, but he quickly tells himself to drop it and stop thinking about that stuff for now. Urias thinks about how much he's changed, how he has a new life and actual friends now, and he really wants to protect it all. He looks ahead with a serious face, ready to take on whatever comes next because this escort mission seems like a huge deal, and he tells himself he's gonna give it everything he's got. He pulls his collar tight and gets his uniform settled. It turns out some royals were in town for an inspection, and they're finally heading back, so Urias was the one picked to go along as their guard for the long trip back home. When the day to leave finally rolls around, Urias can't help but let out a wow when he sees this massive armored truck parked and waiting for them. He's standing there with his mouth open, thinking the magic car is the coolest thing he's ever seen, especially since this thing runs on mana and is packed with magic barriers, making it the only safe way to travel between cities. Sherry spots Urias by the transport and gives him a friendly good morning. Urias turns around and says morning back to her, but then he notices some familiar faces nearby and gets a bit confused, asking if Sophia and Keith are there too. Just then, Sophia waves at him with a big smile while Keith just gives a casual greeting. Sherry laughs and tells him that believe it or not, both of them are actually joining the mission. Keith explains they added more people last night, so he's the assistant driver while Sophia is helping guard, which makes Urias feel way better. Sophia is already thinking about the food she packed for everyone, though Keith tells her she's being way too relaxed for a big job. Elsa shows up to announce they're heading out soon, and the guards start yelling for everyone to get to their spots because the royal party is finally arriving, with the guards clearing a path through the crowd as the guard tells Princess Lyanna to watch her step, and she politely thanks him as she gets ready to board. Urias catches a glimpse of the princess as she passes by and just freezes. She notices him watching and stops for a second to look back. She gives him a really bright, kind smile that completely catches him off guard, but then the story jumps back to the night before, where Urias is looking pretty flustered and red in the face. It's a quiet night at the academy building as the lights stay on inside. Urias stands in the hallway and knocks on a door, announcing that he's there, and someone from inside tells him to go ahead and enter. He opens the door and politely says he's coming in, stepping into the room where he sees Elsa standing right there next to Princess Lyanna. The princess looks over at him and gives him another one of those warm smiles, making Urias completely lose his train of thought while he thinks about how beautiful she is. Lyanna breaks the silence by apologizing for calling him in so suddenly. Elsa introduces the girl as Princess Lyanna, explaining that she really wanted to make sure they met before the mission actually gets moving. Urias completely loses it, realizing he's standing in front of a literal princess and a total celebrity, while Elsa clarifies that the whole job is about guarding her and the royal group. Lyanna gives him a friendly greeting and introduces herself, mentioning that she's already heard plenty of interesting things about him, and then she leans in close with a ton of energy, asking if it's really true he spent 2 whole years in the Twilight Zone fighting off demons and dragons. She starts firing off questions one after another, asking about his favorite foods, if he has a girlfriend, and even if she can call him by a cute nickname. Elsa has to step in and tell the princess to take it down a notch because she's clearly overwhelming the kid. Lyanna apologizes for getting carried away, but Urias just mumbles that it's fine. The mood gets a bit more serious as Elsa explains there's a real reason for this meeting that involves Urias's own well-being, specifically regarding a condition called Twilight Syndrome. It turns out the princess has a rare special ability that lets her sense the density and flow of magical energy in people, which is exactly why Elsa thinks he needs to check his current status, asking Urias if he'll let the princess examine him right now. Urias takes a second to process everything, looking pretty serious as he finally agrees to the checkup. Urias gets ready for the checkup, asking if he needs to take his jacket off, but Lyanna tells him he's fine just the way he is. She stands over him and starts using her special ability, with magical energy flaring out from her eyes as she locks her focus on him, reading every bit of magical flow and density within his body until she finally speaks up, looking pretty shocked while telling him she can't believe a human could actually be this in sync with the Twilight. She explains that even Silas had a crazy high magic density, but Urias is on a whole different level, and honestly, he should have died a long time ago. Lyanna looks him right in the eye and says she isn't really sure how to explain it, but the way his and Silas' bodies have changed makes it seem like they're becoming something closer to demons than humans, leaving Urias standing there completely stunned by the news. Elsa chimes in to keep things grounded, mentioning that it's going to take way more time to solve the mystery of the Twilight and this syndrome, so for the time being, they just have to focus on what's right in front of them and take things one step at a time. With the meeting over, the team finally hits the road, their massive armored truck kicking up dust as it rolls through the rocky wasteland. The massive armored transport continues its long trek through the wasteland, with Urias and Sophia standing out on the top deck. Urias sits there thinking about being called close to a demon, but honestly he kind of saw that coming, and since there's no record of this ever happening to anyone else, he still can't really feel any change in his own body yet. He looks down at his hand, realizing that even after hearing such heavy news, the only thing that really matters is finding the strength to keep his head up and just keep moving forward, no matter what he's turning into. Just then, Sophia walks up and tells him he did a solid job on the mission, catching him a bit off guard. He asks her what's up since she's usually at her post, but she just tells him she's doing her rounds on patrol right now. She explains that she needs to stay on top of everything happening inside the truck in case of an emergency, and Urias just nods along. But then Sophia gets a serious look on her face and calls out his name, leading into her asking him if he's actually planning on going all the way to become an S-rank anti-magic mage. Urias is caught completely off guard and asks her if she actually knew about his situation. Sophia admits it's been a rumor for a while now and figures pretty much everyone else knows too. She mentions she heard the details from her father, which makes Urias wonder about his dad's involvement. Sophia brings up the time he got jumped by that bearded guy with the massive sword. She says her dad is almost never home, but he did mention that Urias has some serious potential. Urias just gives a forced smile, trying to process the fact that people have been watching him. Sophia goes quiet for a second, her face hidden in shadow as the mood gets a bit more heavy. She points out that reaching S rank means he'll be facing off against demons way more often, and Urias nods along, but then she looks him right in the eyes and says she's really counting on him. Urias stays quiet for a moment, looking a bit flustered before finally giving her a simple nod. Urias hears something and looks up, completely caught off guard by a sudden sound in the distance. He and Sophia both snap their heads around, realizing that the quiet moment they were having is officially over. Looking out over the rocky path, Urias sees dark shapes moving along the cliffs, and it's not just one or two, but a whole group of multi-eyed monsters crawling over the stone. Urias doesn't waste a second, shouting out that the lookout just reported monsters showing up right in front of them. He grips his staff and yells for everyone in the area to stay alert and get ready to fight. Turning to Sophia, he tells her to get back to her spot, and she gives him a quick nod before heading off. So Urias stands his ground, looking pretty tense as he watches the horizon for the first wave. The monsters move way faster than they look, swarming out from the rocks and heading straight for the transport truck. Elsa shows up and identifies them as rampage spiders, warning Urias that these B-rank threats are going to be a real pain to deal with. Urias looks over and calls out to Silas, his face showing he's pretty caught off guard by the situation. Silas notes how weird this is since these monsters usually stay way further east, and he can't figure out why they'd be in a safe zone. He admits he's not sure what's going on, but since the swarm is acting so aggressive, they have no choice but to wipe them out. Urias locks in, looking pretty stressed but ready to do whatever he has to do. A massive spider towers over the rock, and Urias realizes that must be the boss of the whole group. Elsa watches the monster closely, looking completely calm while everyone else is on edge. She asks Urias if he can take the boss on his own, promising that she'll handle every other monster herself. So Urias agrees before it even sinks in, but then he totally panics, asking if she's really going to fight the whole swarm alone. Elsa just gives him a confident smile, not looking worried at all about the odds. Seeing her so composed helps him find his nerve, and he tells her he understands and is ready to go. Urias takes a firm step forward, his boot hitting the dirt as he gets ready for the fight. He realizes the other mages have to stay back and guard the transport, meaning it's just him and Elsa heading out to face the swarm. Elsa stands behind him looking totally relaxed, casually saying it's time to get things moving. The two of them stand small against the massive wall of spiders crawling over the rock, but they aren't backing down. Elsa gives him a little smile and tells Urias his job is to take out the big boss leading the pack. Urias looks pretty stressed, but she reassures him by saying she's going to handle every single other monster herself. The giant spider boss stands in the shadows with its eyes glowing, and Elsa repeats that it's finally time to go. Urias grips his sword, thinking he needs to smash through the front line first just to make a path to the boss. But then Elsa flies past him like a blur, leaving him completely shocked as she says she's going in first. She looks incredibly sharp as she draws her weapon, ready to wreck everything in her way. Elsa strikes so fast the spiders don't even see it coming, and Urias can only watch in total shock as the entire front line of the swarm gets shredded into pieces in just a single second. She moves like a blur through the chaos, cutting down every monster in her way while landing perfectly on her feet as the remains of the spiders fall all around her. Elsa casually mentions that she told him she'd handled it, adjusting her gear while looking him in the eye and saying she's taking on everyone else so he can have a clear shot at the boss. Urias just stands there looking completely blown away by how much power she's actually showing off. He quickly snaps out of it and shouts that he's got it, finally finding his focus and charging straight for the massive spider boss through the gap Elsa opened up. He puts everything he has into his physical reinforcement magic, yelling that he's going all out for this hit. Urias lets out a huge swing and catches the giant spider with a clean hit. He's moving fast and slices right through one of its thick legs, dark blood spraying everywhere as the limb flies off. He tells himself he's got this, knowing that if he takes out a rampage black spider's leg, it's basically game over for the monster. So he looks at the bleeding stump and figures all that's left is to finish off the main body, but he stops dead in his track. The severed wound starts bubbling and shifting right in front of his eyes. Urias can't believe what he's seeing and asks if this thing is actually regenerating its lost limb, especially since he spent 2 years fighting these things in the twilight and has never seen one with healing powers like this. It's totally new to him, and it's making him realize that there is definitely something weird going on with this specific monster. The spider looms over him with its eyes glowing bright, showing it's nowhere near done with this fight. Urias grips his sword tight and decides to change his strategy, figuring his best bet now is to go straight for the head. Urias barely manages to leap back as a massive spider leg slams into the ground where he was just standing, and even though he manages to land a counter slash, the dark wound just starts bubbling and healing itself instantly. He realizes his normal hits aren't working because of the regeneration, but then he spots something glowing deep inside the monster's flesh, and he stops for a second, wondering what that weird object could actually be. He figures that sunset-colored ball must be the core keeping the thing alive, so he decides he's got to find a way to smash it. But to get through that thick hide, he knows he'll have to land a perfect combo of strikes all at once. Urias launches himself high into the air to get above the spider's reach, and he goes into a spinning dive, bringing his sword down with everything he's got. He moves like a blur and drives his blade straight into the spot where the core is hidden. He isn't letting up until a blinding light flashes from the wound, showing he finally hit the mark. Urias puts everything into his last move and rips through the monster's defenses, causing a massive explosion of dark energy as the core finally shatters into tiny pieces, completely cutting off the beast's power source. He stands there for a second just watching the light fade out, making sure the giant creature is actually dead as it collapses into a huge, steaming pile of black gunk on the ground. Looking closely at the remains, he notes that the regeneration has finally stopped for good and confirms that the glowing ball was definitely the core keeping the whole thing together. Elsa walks over and asks if he's all finished up, and Urias tells her yeah, then asks how things are going on Silas's end. She looks out over the field of dead monsters and says they've pretty much cleared everything out, and she's honestly shocked, asking him just how many he managed to kill. But Urias just laughs it off and says she was just as impressive. Elsa mentions that his sword skills are pretty unique, but Urias just tells her he had to get creative with his fighting style just to stay alive out in the twilight. Elsa smiles and tells him that's really wonderful, but then she quickly pivots, saying they should probably put that aside for a second and focus on the monster, noting how this specific one seemed to have some crazy healing power. She admits she's never seen anything like it before, and Urias agrees, saying it's a first for him too as they look at the pile of remains. Urias explains that he found a ball the color of a sunset deep inside its body, and the second he smashed it, the monster finally stopped regenerating. Elsa repeats the part about the sunset-colored ball like she's trying to make sense of it, and Urias confirms that's exactly what he saw. She looks out at the rocky landscape and wonders if something like that could actually happen naturally, or if there's a chance someone actually planted it inside the beast on purpose. Elsa asks why on earth anyone would do that to a monster, and Urias tells her he's not sure, but he thinks it's a real possibility. She stays quiet for a moment, thinking it over while Urias just watches her, waiting for a lead. Finally, Elsa says she's going to stay behind to investigate a bit more and tells Urias to head back and report everything to the other mages, which he agrees to immediately. As he walks back toward the armored transport, Sophia waves him down and calls out his name. Urias calls out to Sherry, but Sophia cuts in, telling him she saw everything and that he's actually pretty amazing. He just laughs it off a bit sheepishly and says thanks for the kind words, but Sophia just stands there staring at him with this really intense look. She asks if anything happened or if he got hurt during the fight, so Urias just tells her it's nothing to worry about. He looks back at her, his mind clearly elsewhere as he starts thinking about what Elsa said back at the canyon, wondering if that monster was just a freak of nature or if someone actually set the whole thing up. Urias remembers telling Elsa he wasn't sure if it was a setup, just that it was a possibility, while she just sat there thinking it over. Even though things seem fine, there's just this tiny, nagging bad feeling, like a bit of weight in his chest that he can't quite shake off, but he tells himself there's no use stressing over things he can't change. Better to just keep moving forward. The heavy armored truck kicks up a cloud of dust as it rolls through the rocky canyon path, and ever since that crazy black spider attack, Urias notes that things have been quiet. No other big monsters have shown up to cause trouble. They just keep moving forward, sticking to the road and making steady progress on their journey, until Sophia walks up and calls out his name to get his attention. She lets him know that the plan is to stop at the third barrier city next so they can stock up on supplies, and Urias just nods, telling her he's got it. Sophia lingers for a second, just looking at him with this serious expression like she's got something on her mind. The mention of the city hits home for Urias since that's where he grew up, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. He starts thinking back to his younger days when he was just a kid with dark hair, back when Dan first walked up to him with that cocky grin, asking if he wanted to team up and start a party together. Back in the day at the academy, Dan walked right up to Urias in the courtyard. Urias just stood there blushing and stumbling over his words, asking if Dan was actually sure about picking someone like him. It was a big deal because back then, Dan was basically the star student and the best mage in the whole school, while Urias was just a total dropout who couldn't find a single party willing to take him in. Even though Dan didn't have the best reputation, he told Urias he picked him specifically because he heard he was a serious good guy. Urias just thanked him, feeling genuinely happy for the first time because he thought he'd finally found a place to belong. He really thought someone finally recognized his worth, but then Dan just started barked orders, telling him to handle all the paperwork for their next trip. Then Dan told him to polish his dirty boots like it was nothing, making Urias realize he wasn't a teammate, he was just a pawn. He figured out the truth pretty fast, but Dan just told him not to get the wrong idea about their dynamic, and even though Dan claimed he wasn't just using him, Urias was too scared of being alone to ever leave. Urias just kept pretending he didn't see what was happening, even when Dan told him he was only good for supporting others. Dan basically said he should be happy he was even allowed to help out with stuff he was actually suited for, but then everything led him straight toward the Twilight world, though that's all just stuff from a long time ago. Moving on, the group arrives at a quiet street filled with old stone buildings. Dan and the rest of the party stand there looking pretty surprised by the news they just heard. Elsa tells everyone they're getting their last round of supplies here in the third barrier city, but she also mentions that some top students from the academy are joining them right now to head for the first barrier city together. Since the next leg of the trip is going to be non-stop, she tells the student group they can go have some free time, as long as they meet back in 2 hours without being late, and the whole crew says they got it. As the group breaks up, Sophia spots Urias walking away and calls out his name, but he just gives her a quick smile over his shoulder, telling her he needs a second to go clear his head and think about something. Sophia just stands there watching him go, looking a little bit worried about what's on his mind. Moving on, the scene shifts over to a huge, old stone building that looks like a classic academy. Urias stands right in front of it, thinking about how the place hasn't changed a bit and how nostalgic it feels to be back. He goes quiet for a second, just staring at the school while the memories start flooding back, mostly bad ones about being looked down on, and the moment his old teammates decided to just leave him behind. Suddenly, some guy nearby stops and looks at him, wondering if he recognizes that uniform Urias is wearing. The guy walks up and asks if he's one of those students from the 7th barrier city who's supposed to be guarding the princess, since it turns out a few top students from this academy were picked to join the mission and meet up with them here. Dan looks down as the realization starts to hit him. He can't believe who might be standing right there in front of him. He tries to act casual at first, introducing himself as Dan and telling the newcomer it's nice to meet him, but he stops mid-sentence, looking closer and thinking to himself that he's definitely seen that face somewhere before. Memories of their old battles start flashing back, showing just how much they struggled back in the day. Dan keeps staring, trying to put the pieces together, while the others just watch the two of them stand there. Urias stays quiet, looking back at his old teammates with a look that's both tense and serious. He knows he can't just walk away or pretend he doesn't know who they are, not after everything they went through. So he finally speaks up, telling them they've all grown pretty tall, but their voices haven't changed at all. So as he says their names, Dan, Leona, and Nora, the three of them just freeze up, looking like they've seen a ghost. Urias looks them right in the eye and confirms it's really him, Urias Curtis, telling them it's been a long time since they last spoke. Urias just stands there with a calm look on his face, waiting for it to sink in while Leona, Dan, and Nora all stare at him like they've seen a ghost. Dan can barely get the name out, whispering to himself. The realization ripples through the group as they wonder if this is really the same Urias they used to know. Dan locks eyes with him. Sweat starts rolling down his face because the vibe is just way too different now. He takes a deep breath to try and steady himself, finally snapping out of his shock. Dan says he never thought Urias was still alive, asking if some mage rescued him and why he didn't just come back home sooner. Urias looks down for a second, the mood getting real heavy before he finally tells them straight up that nobody rescued him. He survived out in the twilight all by himself for 2 years. Dan's jaw just dropped. He stares at Urias in total disbelief. Then he starts laughing it off, calling Urias an idiot and telling him to come up with a better lie than that, especially with his new hair. Urias doesn't even flinch. He looks them right in the eye and says it's not a lie. He really did spend 2 years surviving in the twilight. His face goes dark as he stares them down, telling them flat out that he remembers exactly what they did to him back then. The group starts to panic, and Nora whispers to Dan that they're in deep trouble, asking if they're actually going to get in trouble for what happened. Dan tries to keep his cool while sweat pours down his face, telling himself not to freak out because there's no proof of anything anyway. He reaches out like they're still buddies, telling Urias he's got the whole thing wrong and must be misunderstanding what went down. Dan starts making up excuses on the spot, claiming they actually went back to rescue him, but he just wasn't there anymore. He looks completely desperate while he tries to sell the lie, asking Urias if that makes sense and why it wasn't their fault. Nora and Leona immediately change their tune, putting on these awkward, fake smiles while Nora tries to act friendly. She notices his new gear and asks if that's the uniform for the elite Royal Guard selection students, realizing he's moved up in the world. Urias just looks away while Nora keeps talking, suggesting they should just forget about everything that happened in the past and be friends again. Urias gives them a cold look, telling the group that in the end, they haven't changed a bit. Dan's face goes pale, and he asks what Urias just said, feeling the vibe shift as Urias stands his ground, confirming he's part of the Royal Guard selection and already an A-rank mage. He doesn't stop there though, telling them he's on his way to becoming S-rank next. The news hits the trio like a ton of bricks. Dan, Nora, and Leona just stand there with their mouths open, completely unable to believe the kid they ditched is now way above them. Nora can barely even get his name out, whispering Urias's name while her head spins from the shock of it all. Dan is stuck on that one detail, repeating the words S-rank back like it's some kind of bad joke he can't understand. The silence is broken by a low, creepy laugh that starts to build up, getting louder and louder until Dan just loses it, laughing right in Urias's face. He tells him there's no way that's true and calls him a complete idiot for even trying to claim something so crazy. He keeps the insults coming, mocking the idea of surviving 2 years in the twilight, telling Urias his brain must have totally snapped from the trauma of being left behind. Urias doesn't back down. He clenches his fist and looks Dan dead in the eye, telling him flat out that this isn't a lie either. Dan stands there with a twisted grin, sweating as he realizes Urias might be serious. Urias tells the group he's already got them figured out, clenching his fist as he says he isn't the same person they used to know. The air starts to vibrate as a surge of energy gathered in his hand begins to flare up. He stands there looking calm while the power explodes around him, telling them that this is what his magic looks like now. He explains that this is only a tiny fraction of his actual strength, asking if they can finally see how much he's surpassed them. Dan, Nora, and Leona are completely floored, standing there with their mouths open, unable to process the raw power coming off him. Dan's eyes go wide as he stares at the energy, barely able to even form a word from the shock. He starts losing it, screaming that this kind of power is impossible, and he can't believe the kid he looked down on is actually better than him. Urias just gives him a cold look, asking if he needs to pull out his A-rank certificate to prove he isn't joking around. Dan is sweating bullets now, his face pale as he realizes he's completely outmatched. He yells out Urias's name with a mix of anger and fear, realizing the power gap between them is way bigger than he ever thought. Urias looks down with a cold expression, while Princess Leanna stands nearby looking completely stressed out by the heavy vibe. He turns his back on his old party, his cloak swishing as he decides he's finally done with them. Urias looks over his shoulder one last time, telling Dan that he's heading out now. He doesn't even wait for a reaction, just giving them a casual goodbye as he walks away. Dan is left standing there shaking and sweating, looking like he wants to say something, but he's too stuck in his own head. Walking back to his new team, Urias mentions he actually expected those guys to be over at the academy by this point. Lyanna looks at him with a concerned face, asking if those people were actually his old acquaintance. Urias just gives a quiet nod, confirming that they used to be his teammate. He tells the group he'll explain everything to Sophia and Keith, so they aren't left in the dark about who those guys were. Once she hears the details, Sophia gets visibly annoyed, saying the way those people treated him is just the absolute worst. Sophia is pretty heated, saying what those guys did is basically a crime, but then she sighs, realizing they don't have any proof, and it's been so long that nobody would even remember. Urias just looks calm now, telling her that it's fine because facing his old team actually helped him deal with his past, and he finally feels like he's sorted everything out in his head. Gil, Sophia, and Keith all stand there watching him, looking at the kid with a lot of respect for how he's handling things. Breaking the silence, Gil speaks up and calls out to Urias, getting the kid's attention. He brings up their recent mock battle, telling Urias that seeing him actually go all out back then, well, it made him pretty happy to see that kind of power. Urias just blinks, totally caught off guard by the sudden compliment from the big guy. Gil goes on to say he heard that old party of Urias's is going to be traveling with them all the way to the first barrier city. He tells Urias not to let it get to him, since he and his partner don't really care, but if those guys try to mess with him again, he wants Urias to come straight to him. Gil flashes a scary grin, promising that if they step out of line, he'll personally beat the absolute crap out of them for him. Hearing that, Urias can't help but smile, looking genuinely happy to have someone like Gil in his corner. Sherry looks over at Urias with a really serious, blushing face, clearly trying to find the right words to say to him. She tells him that everything he's been through is part of who he is now, so he shouldn't try to force himself to forget it. But at the same time, he's not alone anymore because he has all of them by his side. And then she looks him right in the eyes, almost tearing up, and asks him to please stop making such a lonely face, leaving Urias just standing there, totally stunned and blushing from how much she cared. He takes a second to process it before bowing his head and giving her a sincere thank you, while the rest of the crew just watches them. The heavy mood finally breaks as Urias laughs, joking that this is actually the second time her words have made him want to cry, and Sherry just laughs along. But Sophia immediately jumps in, asking when the first time was, which makes Urias freeze up and Sherry start to panic. Urias tries to backtrack and say he didn't actually cry, while Sophia keeps teasing him for the details and Sherry yells for everyone to just forget it. And while they're all messing around, their armored truck keeps rolling through the Rocky Mountain, heading toward their next destination. Urias looks out as the group keeps moving forward, and the narration mentions that they just kept their journey going, and even though they ended up traveling with Dan and his crew for the rest of the way, things weren't exactly friendly. Dan and Urias both went out of their way to avoid each other, never saying a single word the whole time. Eventually, a massive white city built right into the cliffs comes into view, and Urias and the girls can't help but stare in total awe, realizing they finally made it to the first barrier city. Elsa meets them there with a big smile, telling the whole group they did a solid job making it through such a long trip. But then she casually mentions they need to get ready for the royal dinner party tonight, which sends Urias into a total panic. He starts sweating and stammering, telling her he's only hearing about this party for the first time right now. So Elsa just gives him a goofy look and apologizes, acting like it totally slipped her mind to tell him sooner. She doesn't give him a break though, adding that he also has to attend a meeting for S-rank mages later on, leaving Urias looking completely drained. Urias realizes he finally has some free time on his hands, so he plans to drop his stuff at the inn and go check out the town, which is full of these massive stone buildings and tall towers reaching up into the sky. He takes a second to just breathe it all in, feeling pretty relieved to finally be there. Since Sherry and Sophia went off to do some shopping and Keith is busy fixing up the magic car, Urias decides he's just going to spend his time doing some solo sightseeing through the busy streets where all the locals are just living their lives and walking around. It's a pretty lively scene with people everywhere, but the whole place feels really calm and beautiful to him. He can't help but smile at how chill the vibe is, but then he spots the castle and is totally blown away by how huge it is, thinking it's exactly what you'd expect for a royal home. He knows the royal family are the ones who keep the barriers up and keep everyone safe, so seeing where they live is a pretty big deal. The logic behind how the first barrier works is still a total mystery, but apparently it can only be managed from within this specific city. Urias walks down the stone steps thinking about how the royal family is wrapped in secrets, especially with Princess Lyanna having that unique extra ability. He suddenly stops when he hears a commotion nearby. Turns out there's a massive guy getting into it with a girl right in the middle of the alley. The big guy is fuming, yelling that she's the one who bumped into him, and now she's acting like he's the one who needs to apologize. The girl doesn't seem scared at all, telling him his huge frame is blocking the entire sidewalk and he's just being a total nuisance to everyone. She stands her ground and asks him if he's planning on moving anytime soon. She repeats herself, making it clear that his big body is just taking up way too much space on the path. She looks him dead in the eye and asks one more time if he's actually going to step aside. The guy argues that if he was really in her way, she could have just said something instead of trying to shove past him on purpose. She fires back that talking to him is a waste of breath, especially since he spends all this time just drinking and passing out right there in the street. The girl doesn't back down, telling him he's just being a nuisance to everyone around. The big guy clenches his fist and yells that where he drinks and sleeps is nobody's business but his own. She realizes talking is a waste of time and admits she bumped into him on purpose just to see if he'd get the hint, which only makes the guy's blood boil even more. He calls her a brat and asks if she's looking to get hurt right then and there. Just as things are about to get ugly, Urias jumps into the middle of the mess with a nervous smile, apologizing and asking if the girl did something to upset him. The big guy isn't having it and demands to know who the hell Urias is while the girl just looks on with a blank stare. Urias starts to sweat as the guy tells him to get lost if he's not involved. He's frantically trying to think of a way to step in without making it worse, and realizes he has to say something to help her out, so he suddenly blurts out that he's her brother. The big guy looks at them both and shouts that they don't look a single bit alike, so Urias panics and quickly adds that they're actually step-siblings. That word seems to hit the guy like a ton of bricks as he repeats it back in shock, his mind clearly going to some weird places. He starts screaming at the top of his lungs about how they're living together and probably having some secret romance, losing his mind because she's way too pretty for Urias. Urias is losing it, asking the guy if he's actually enjoying this weird fantasy, and wondering if the dude is just straight up drunk. Princess Lyanna decides to play along with the fake sibling story, but Urias panics when she literally calls it a setup out loud. She goes quiet for a second, leaving Urias sweating as he tries to figure out what she's planning. Then she turns on the charm with puppy dog eyes, begging her big brother to save her. That's the final straw for the big guy, who yells at them to shut up while swinging a massive fist to wreck them both. Urias notices mana swirling around the guy's hand, and realizes he's actually using a wind magic move called Air Knuckle. He doesn't even flinch, just calmly brings his hand up to meet the attack, and stops the huge, magic-boosted punch with his palm like it's absolutely nothing. Lyanna just stands there with her mouth open, totally shocked that Urias is actually this strong, but he just looks the guy in the eye and asks him to please calm down so they can keep things peaceful. Urias tells the guy he's willing to let this go if he just stops now, and the big dude looks like he's finally realizing he messed with the wrong person. Staring him down, Urias gives one last warning for the guy to just turn around and leave. Everything goes quiet for a second, But then the girl looks up at Urias, who's still looking a bit stressed out from the whole situation. She asks if that was illusion magic he used, pointing out how weird it is to see non-attribute magic that isn't meant for healing. Urias nervously confirms it's an original move of his, but he's secretly panicking because he can't believe she actually saw his attack. She mentions the Twilight Sword and then asks him point blank if he's actually Urias Curtis. Urias is completely caught off guard, confirming his name but asking how she even knows who he is. She just gives him this smug, knowing smile like she's been holding on to a secret this whole time. Turns out she's actually Isla Reese, an S-rank mage and a 6th-year student from the First Barrier City Academy, and she gives him a playful wink, thanking her big brother Urias for coming to the rescue. Urias is standing there completely losing it. He can't believe he's actually looking at a top-tier S-rank mage. He stares at her, trying to process how someone so small could have that kind of rank, while Isla just waits for him to snap out of it. But then he realizes she's actually a 6th-year student, making her 2 years older than him despite the height difference. Isla leans in with a scary look, asking if he was just wondering how a little shrimp like her became an S-rank. Urias starts panicking, waving his hands and swearing he wasn't thinking that at all. She tells him it's fine since being short is just the truth. Then she whips out her official license to show him she's the real deal. Urias checks the card and sees it's definitely legit, but then he asks her how she even knows his name in the first place. Isla explains she heard about him from Gil and Claudia. Apparently, they told her a total monster who spent 2 years in Twilight was coming to the city. The monster comment definitely hits Urias weird, but she moves on and asks if he's going to the big dinner party tonight, which he quietly confirms. Since there's time to kill, she tells him he's hanging out with her for a bit and offers to buy him some tea. Urias gets all flustered and formal, thanking her as he follows along behind. Isla stops in her tracks and repeats the word senior back at him, like she's never heard it before, making Urias totally freak out. He stammers that since he's a 4th year and she's a 6th year, she's definitely his senior regardless of where they're from, then starts wondering if he accidentally offended her. Isla looks down for a second, just saying she sees how it is, while Urias watches her, but then she looks up with a huge smile and starts shouting about how great he is. She decides right then that she likes him and is going to be the one to look after him from now on. Urias is completely lost, asking why she's suddenly acting like this. She gets a bit serious, explaining that because she's so small, people look down on her constantly, which makes her really sensitive to how others treat her. She brings up those drunk mages from earlier, complaining that if she were some huge, muscular guy, they never would have tried anything. She asks Urias for backup, and he just gives a tired response. She leans in close, telling him she can't stand anyone who treats her like a joke, but she really appreciates that he showed her actual respect. So she calls him Good Uria, and even though he tries to correct his name and the weird brother-sister vibe she's forcing, he realizes she's just a really high-energy person. They finally make it to the shop, and Isla leads the way inside, calling out a casual greeting as they walk through the door. The shop owner, Mika, spots them coming in and gives Isla a warm welcome. Isla greets her back with a big smile and asks if they can grab a private room, which Mika is totally cool with, telling them to go ahead and make themselves at home. Isla gives a little finger gun gesture and says thanks, mentioning she took care of those drunk guys from earlier as quietly as possible. Mika just laughs it off and says she appreciates it like always, though Urias is standing there silently questioning what her version of quiet actually looks like. Once they sit down, Urias mentions that she must be a real regular and says it's pretty cool she has a go-to spot like this. Ella just giggles to herself. She takes a sip of her drink, telling him the milk cocoa here is the best before asking what he got. Urias tells her he's just sticking with black coffee. Isla gives him this weird, judgmental look that completely catches him off guard. Changing the subject, she mentions that everything he's been through, living in Twilight and all the events leading up to now, is honestly a pretty wild story. Urias agrees and jokes that he's probably the most legendary lost child in human history, which gets another laugh out of Isla as they relax. But then she settles down and looks him right in the eye, asking where he really fits into his own story. Urias stays quiet, looking pretty stressed as Isla asks him if what he has is Twilight Syndrome, which she then confirms. He pulls back his sleeve to show her his arm, which is covered in these strange, dark flame markings. Isla is totally blown away, asking if those marks are seriously over level 5, and Urias just nods, saying they probably are. He mentions that Princess Lyanna actually took a look at them too, which reminds Isla that he was busy guarding her earlier. She asks with a smile if the girl was doing okay, and a surprised Urias asks if she actually knows the princess. Isla casually explains they're childhood friends since her own family is nobility, making Urias realize she's actually a high-class lady. She gets a serious look and tells him family status is stupid, warning him that if he starts acting weird around her because of it, she'll beat him up. He quickly agrees as they wrap things up, and head back outside to the street. Isla waves goodbye, telling him she'll see him later tonight as she starts walking off. Urias gives her a big smile and shouts out his thanks for the treats as they go their separate ways. Urias walks through the area, totally unaware that a shady guy is watching him from behind a brick wall. The guy has a really intense look in his eyes, just staring him down from the shadows as he passes. Once they get inside, Urias is stunned by how big the place is, and Lyanna tells him the royal castle is always this impressive. She mentions that the staff is even lending them formal clothes for the dinner party tonight, which is news to him. Before the event, Lyanna says the girls are heading to the baths to wash up since the tubs are huge, and Urias tells her that's fine. He starts getting pretty nervous about the whole thing and asks Keith to stick by his side during the party so he isn't alone. Keith just casually apologizes and says he's actually skipping the party, which leaves Urias looking completely shocked. He explains that some guards he met on the way over invited him for dinner, and he'd much rather do that than go to a stiff formal event. Urias complains about being left alone, but Keith tells him he's got Sherry and the girls to escort, so he needs to handle it. Urias just slumps over, sighing about how his only bit of backup is gone, but he figures there's nothing he can do about it now. Urias is just walking through the halls when he spots a wooden sign hanging on the stone wall. He realizes there's still a ton of time before the party starts, and the sign is pointing right toward the bath. He figures he might as well go wash up since he has nothing else to do, but he walks right past a paper taped to the floor that warns everyone the men's and women's baths were swapped for the day. He steps inside and is blown away by how massive the room is, thinking the royal baths are seriously impressive. The place feels even bigger because it seems totally empty, but as he looks around the corner, he spots someone already sitting by the water and realizes he isn't alone in there after all. His face turns bright red as he starts worrying about how awkward it'll be if he actually knows the person, so he tries to get a better look through all the steam and mist filling the giant room until he sees it's Ayla, and she looks completely caught off guard to see him standing there. The two of them just stand there as silhouettes in the thick steam, completely frozen. Neither of them can even move because of the shock, and then they both start screaming at the top of their lungs at the exact same time. Urias is totally losing his mind, wondering why in the world Ayla is even in there, while Ayla is busy screaming herself, demanding to know what he thinks he's doing. He quickly grabs a towel to cover up and asks if he's blind, since the sign clearly said the baths were swapped today. Urias is bright red and stammers that he didn't see any sign at all, but he's still confused why she's even using the castle's bath. So she explains that she's loved this place since she was a kid and used to bathe here with Lyanna all the time. Urias decides he needs to get out of there immediately, and Ayla just looks away, feeling just as awkward about the whole thing. Later on, a girl tells him he needs to stop acting like a little kid exploring the castle, and he just gives a nervous laugh and says he's sorry. The two of them just stand there in total shock. Urias is practically jumping out of his skin while Ayla clutches her towel, both of them turning bright red as they realize the situation is about to get way worse. Urias starts panicking, telling her his female classmates are already in the changing room and things are looking bad, so they both freeze when they hear the girls laughing and heading straight for the water. Urias desperately asks what they're supposed to do now, and Ayla just stares at him, her mind completely racing. Urias finally decides there's only one way out of this mess. He looks determined despite the embarrassment and tells her that if they leave right this second, they might still make it. He figures they should just come clean and apologize immediately, and Ayla starts to agree that it might be their only shot. But then the reality of the situation hits her like a truck. She realizes how it looks for a top-tier S-rank mage to be caught naked in a bath with a guy she just met, so she yells for him to wait. She tells him she's not sure anyone would actually believe their story even if they were honest. Urias is totally caught off guard by her sudden panic, but Ayla puts her foot down and says they absolutely have to find a way to hide and keep this a secret no matter what. Urias is practically in tears now, asking her how they're even supposed to hide when Sherry and the other girls are about to walk through the door at any moment. Ayla just grits her teeth, looking completely stressed out as she tries to come up with a plan before they get caught together. Ayla is losing it. She's got her eyes squeezed shut, and her face is bright red while she tries to think of a way out of this, but then her eyes snap open. It looks like she finally figured something out and is ready to move. She points her finger up and tells Urias that she's got a great idea to save them both. Just then, Sherry and the other girl walk into the bath area. They're blown away by how huge the palace bath is and how quiet it feels with nobody around. Sherry stops and realizes someone is actually already in the water, seeing two girls sitting together at the edge. The two people in the bath are sitting perfectly still. They look incredibly nervous as the girls get closer, while Sherry and her friend just keep chatting away, having no clue that anything weird is going on. Back in the moment Ayla came up with her plan, She looks over at Urias with a serious look and says she knows what to do. She mentions that Urias is actually really good at illusion magic. Urias is caught off guard but says that he can handle it, so Ayla tells him that makes things a lot easier, and Urias just asks her what she has in mind. Ayla's face is bright red as she points her finger up, telling Urias he should just use an illusion to make himself look like a girl. Urias just stares at her, looking completely stunned by the idea. Ayla keeps going, explaining that he just needs to layer a girl's image over himself so no one gets suspicious when they leave. Urias is sweating and blushing like crazy, but he finally nods and says he gets how the plan is supposed to work. While they set it up, Ayla secretly apologizes to Sherry in her head, since she's actually using Sherry's body as the model for the illusion. She thinks to herself that seeing Sherry naked that one time actually ended up being pretty useful for a situation like this. So they start the act, with Ayla calling out to her sister that it's time to get out of the bath, and Urias nervously playing along. A little later, they're both fully dressed and sitting on a bench, where Urias sighs and says he can't believe they actually made it out alive. Ayla gets a super serious look on her face and warns Urias that he better not tell a single soul about what just happened. Urias freaks out and promises to keep his mouth shut, pointing out that he's the one who'd be in the most trouble if anyone found out. Ayla asks if those girls from earlier were actually his friends, making sure she remembered Sherry's name right. Urias confirms they are, letting her know the blonde is Sherry and the girl with black hair is Sophia. Urias mentions that's exactly why the whole situation felt so awkward for him, but Ayla just gives a short response while looking away. She turns back with a bit of a teasing look, asking if he actually has a ton of girlfriends. Urias looks totally caught off guard, quickly insisting that it's not like that and those two are really the only ones. When he asks why she's even bringing it up, Ayla just gives him a blank stare and says it's nothing. She decides it's time to get moving, telling him they need to get changed and ready to go, which Urias agrees with. Ayla gets a scary look on her face and orders him to wipe any images of her from his brain immediately, leaving Urias stammering and completely panicked. He looks over at his friends, thinking about how Sherry and Sophia are both undeniably pretty, but something else is stuck on his mind. He grabs his head in frustration because no matter how hard he tries, those mental images of Ayla just won't go away. Sophia notices him acting weird and calls his name, asking if he has something he wants to say to them after staring for so long. Urias is completely stunned seeing the girls dressed up. Sherry is blushing like crazy while Sophia asks him straight up what he thinks of how they look. He gets all flustered but manages to tell them that he thinks they both look really beautiful. Sherry just looks down without saying a word, her face hidden in shadow as she moves closer. She reaches out to fix his collar, telling him his tie is crooked, and that's way more important than what he's talking about. The two of them share a quiet moment where she just looks at him, and Urias can't help but blush while thinking. Just then, a voice calls out to Urias from behind, making him turn his head to see who showed up. It turns out to be Gil, looking sharp in a full suit as he says it's been a while, and Urias is totally surprised to see him there. Gil starts thanking Urias and Sherry for always taking care of Sophia, but Sophia gets super embarrassed and tells them all to stop talking like that. Gil lets her know they have to go greet some of the big shots since they're at the event, but she just groans about what a pain the whole thing is. As they watch them go, Sherry mentions that Sophia actually looks happy to see her dad, and Urias just laughs because she's still complaining anyway. Elsa walks over and asks if the two of them are having a good time at the party, so Urias laughs a bit and admits he's actually feeling pretty nervous. Ayla shows up and tells Urias he should just relax and enjoy the event since they finally made it, and Urias is stoked to see her, calling her Ayla Senpai. He tells her she looks absolutely amazing in her dress. She just giggles and thanks him, looking a little shy about the compliment while Urias decides to introduce Sherry properly, mentioning they met earlier even though the situation was a bit weird, but Ayla looks confused and says she thought this was the first time they were actually meeting, which makes Urias and Sherry both freeze up in a total panic. Urias starts flailing his arms and rambling about how he's just an idiot and they haven't met. He covers by saying everyone knows her because she's a famous S-rank, leaving Sherry shocked by the news while Ayla introduces herself properly as an S-rank mage from the first barrier city, and then Sherry stammers out her own name, and Ayla mentions she actually ran into Urias in town earlier and heard all kinds of stories. She says she heard about Sherry too, so it felt like she already knew her, then comments on how Urias's life is always so chaotic between school and his work, which makes Sherry turn bright red, looking at Urias while asking if he seriously told Ayla about what happened back in the bath. Urias starts sweating bullets and defensively insists he didn't say a word, so Sherry just stares him down and Ayla stands there looking totally lost, repeating the word Beth, like she can't figure out why it just came up. Sherry asks if he actually told that story about what happened in the bath, and Urias frantically swears he didn't say anything, which just leaves Ayla looking even more confused as she repeats the word back to them again, wondering what's going on. Sherry tries to play it cool by asking if Isla heard anything, but then immediately starts backtracking and saying it's totally nothing. Isla asks what she was supposed to hear about Beth in the first place, making Sherry freak out even harder while trying to act like it's no big deal. But then Elsa suddenly shows up and calls out to Urias to get his attention. Urias tells Elsa she's a total lifesaver because his brain was basically short-circuiting, and she tells him he actually has some guests waiting. A guy in a hat tips it and introduces himself as a reporter from the Twilight newspaper, and right behind him a bunch of other guys show up from the Sunset Journal and the Barrier City Time, all looking like they want a piece of the story. A group of reporters starts shouting out the names of their magazines, Weekly Teimashi, Monthly Young Teimashi, and even the Teimashi Paradise Special Edition, all crowding around to congratulate Urias on officially becoming the 13th S-rank anti-magic mage. Urias stands there holding his papers, looking completely overwhelmed as the reality of the situation hits him. He's frozen in place with a look of total shock. He stammers out a question to Silas about what's going on, but Elsa just laughs and tells him to relax, saying this is just a little greeting. She explains that a new S-rank being born is a massive deal, so she took the liberty of inviting all these different news crews to see him. The reporters tell him it's just a standard ceremony and that he shouldn't be so tense. He just needs to answer a few things, but Urias is barely holding it together, realizing that this is basically a full-blown press conference. Watching from the side, Isla thinks back to her own promotion and how it was just as sudden for her, though she's mostly just surprised that one of those weird magazines is still around. The reporter with the hat steps forward and asks if he can start with the first question, pointing out that tons of people already knew Urias was destined to be picked as an S-rank mage from the very start. The reporter gets right to the point, asking Urias about the crazy rumor that he actually lived in the Twilight Zone for 2 whole years. Urias breaks into a sweat and glances over at Elsa for help, but she just gives him a look like he should just come clean, so he takes a breath and tells them straight up that it's the truth. He explains to the crowd that he really did spend 2 years living out in the Twilight, and that he only just got back to the city recently. One of the older reporters looks like he's seen a ghost, stuttering as he tries to process that the rumors aren't just talk, and Urias doesn't back down. He just looks him in the eye and gives a firm yes. The whole room goes dead silent for a second. Everyone is just standing there with their mouths open, completely shocked by the massive news. Suddenly, the place explodes as everyone starts yelling that this is the scoop of a lifetime, demanding a special edition and firing off questions about where he's from and how he even lived out there, which completely overwhelms Urias. He starts panicking as the reporters crowd him. Everyone is screaming for Mr. Curtis to give them more detail. By the time it's finally over, Urias is looking pretty rough. He's dizzy and just mumbles about how totally wiped out he is. Isla greets Urias after the press conference and asks how everything went. Urias looks pretty drained as he tells her he tried to be honest about the main stuff, even if he had to stay a bit vague on certain details. Isla tells him he did a great job and says they need to keep moving because there's an S-rank mage meeting next. She mentions she's going to have to do another quick outfit change, which leaves Urias just standing there blinking as he tries to keep up with the busy schedule. Sherry steps in to let Urias know that she and Elsa are going to head back to the inn for now. Urias tells them he's got it and starts saying goodbye, but Sherry stops and looks over at Ayla for a second. She clenches her hands together and asks Ayla to please look after Urias for her, leaving both Urias and Ayla totally surprised by how serious she's being. Ayla breaks into a big smile and tells Sherry she can definitely count on her. As they start walking away together, Ayla talks about how Sherry is such a sweet girl. Urias just smiles and says he's really thankful to have her around though. Ayla reminds him that since he's about to be an S-rank mage, his days of having a normal school life are probably over. Ayla looks ahead and tells Urias that he needs to be ready for all kinds of changes coming his way. She thinks it's better to have that mindset from the start, especially since Urias looks her right in the eye and gives a firm yes, showing he's ready for whatever comes next. Meanwhile, back in a quiet room, Dan stands by himself with a dark look on his face while holding a letter addressed to him. It's from Leona and Nora, letting him know that they've already started the paperwork to head home without him, and that they can't follow him as a leader anymore. They write that they understand why he feels the way he does about Urias, but they realize that they're the ones who were wrong the whole time. They explain that they don't know the full truth about Urias, but that mana he showed was real, and it's obvious that even if all three of them teamed up, they wouldn't stand a chance against that kind of overwhelming power. Looking back at how much stronger Urias has become, they tell Dan they think it's better if they just don't get involved with him anymore, before ending the note by saying goodbye to him for good. Dan's grip tightens as he crushes the paper in his hand, cursing Leona and Nora under his breath for leaving him behind. He starts losing it, yelling about how everyone is just messing with him and calling them all pieces of trash. Dan stands there alone, refusing to believe he can't win and calling the girls idiots for leaving. He thinks there's no way he can lose, especially not with the way he is now, so he blames Urias for everything, claiming it's his fault for looking down on him this whole time. With a look of total rage on his face, he yells Urias's name and says he's definitely going to kill him. Meanwhile, Urias is walking with Ayla and asks what actually happens at S-Rank meeting. She tells him it's mostly just reporting on what's been going on lately and checking out any weird stuff they've noticed, though today will probably just be a chance for him to introduce himself. They reach the meeting room and stop at the door as it opens up, and inside the room, a woman with a long braid is already waiting by the table, and she gives them a big smile, telling the two of them that they're pretty early. Urias says hello and asks where the rest of the group is, but Elsa just laughs and says the others are all the type to do things at their own pace. Gil and Urias both look up as the door opens, and Claudia walks right in apologizing for being a little late. She gives Urias a huge smile and says it's been a while, and he's honestly just happy she actually remembers him. Claudia turns to Ayla next, saying it's been ages and asking if it's true she and Urias have already become close. She starts teasing her about how she used to be so shy, but now acts like a total pro, which just makes Ayla snap and tell her to stop talking. Ayla just sighs, thinking to herself about how Claudia hasn't changed at all and still has that same older sister energy, even though she's only 27, which she makes sure to point out with a little sign while Ayla just watches her, completely losing it when Claudia asks Urias if he wants to hear some old stories about her. Claudia starts listing off embarrassing stuff like dancing and cosplay, while Ayla tries to physically stop her, making Urias realize it's probably better if he stays out of this. Once things calm down a bit, Gil asks if they're only waiting on a guy named Roy now, and Elsa says that's right, except she mentions that the final member is actually already in the room with them. Urias just stands there for a second, not really expecting anything to happen, when a dagger suddenly flies out of nowhere straight at his head. He catches a glimpse of it just in time, and reacts instantly, reaching out and grabbing the blade before it can even touch him. The guy with the glasses says he sees how it is, mentioning that Urias has pretty good moves, and that he probably should have thrown it a bit faster. He goes on to say it looks like Urias is the type of person who really locks in once a real fight starts. Urias is just sweating, trying to find his words because he didn't feel anyone behind him at all until the dagger was already in the air. The guy smiles and introduces himself as Roy, telling Urias it's good to meet him, and that they should both cause some trouble on the front line. Urias nervously tells him nice to meet him too, but then Roy stops and wonders if Urias is ranked number 12 or 13, making Urias confused until someone explains they're talking about where everyone stands within the S rank. Ayla clears it up, telling him he's actually 13 since she's the one holding the 12th spot. Roy keeps the introductions going, casually mentioning that he's actually the number 3 ranked mage in the group, and then a girl with long hair chimes in, saying she holds the number 7 spot. The guy in the round glasses speaks up next, telling Urias he's rank 4, while pointing out another guy nearby. Elsa joins the conversation with a totally relaxed vibe, mentioning she's actually number 1. Urias can't believe how chill she is considering she's the strongest. She goes on to explain that these S-rank numbers aren't some absolute rule about who's better, but they set them up to make things easier for the chain of command. Urias listens closely, saying he finally understands why the ranking system exists. Elsa adds with a smile that it also helps for simple stuff, like figuring out where everyone sits or who gets to pick their snacks first. She claps her hands together and tells everyone to take a seat so they can get the meeting started, but Urias looks around and asks where the rest of the mages are, only for Elsa to tell him that the other members won't be showing up to this particular meeting. She explains that while they wanted a full house, it's just not possible to pull every S-rank mage to one location since they all have to stay back and defend their own cities. Elsa mentions she'll have him check the meeting records later on, and Urias just nods, saying he understands the situation. She gives him a warm smile and says that with the explanations out of the way, she wants to officially welcome him to the team. The whole group of top-tier mages stands together, giving him a collective welcome as they finally accept him as one of their own. Urias takes it all in, staring back at them with a look of total focus and determination. He thinks about how his mind is already made up. His only goal is to free humanity from this dark world, and he's ready to fight beside these people to tear through the shadows and finally bring the blue sky back to everyone again. He speaks up clearly, telling the group he's looking forward to working with all of them from here on out. Outside, the massive spires of the city stand tall against the fading light, a quiet moment before things get crazy. The meeting finally ends, and Urias starts walking back through the cobblestone streets alone, letting out a long breath as the weight of everything that just happened starts to sink in. After all the introductions are finished, the rest of the meeting goes pretty smoothly, and they eventually decide to call it a night. Ayla waves goodbye, telling Urias to take care of himself, and mentioning that since S-rank mages move around so much, they'll probably see each other again sooner than he thinks. Urias just nods and agrees, but then she gets this scary look on her face and warns him that if he ever says a word about the Beth incident, she'll never forgive him. Urias starts freaking out and promises he'll take that secret to his grave, so as he leaves, he can't help but think about how much he really owes Ella for everything she's done for him lately. He walks through the city under the dark trees, but his mind is still stuck on the meeting and how that weird twilight orb was brought up as a topic, even though it turns out none of the top mages had any idea what it actually was. Since no one had answers, they just ended things by telling everyone to stay on high alert, leaving Urias to wonder if it's just another mystery of the Twilight world. The streets are pretty empty as he makes his way back, and everything seems quiet until the sound of his own footsteps is the only thing he hears echoing against the building. He suddenly stops and looks back, realizing someone is actually following him, and they aren't even trying to hide how much they want to kill him. Urias stops and looks over his shoulder at the person following him, and it turns out to be Dan, who looks absolutely furious as he yells out Urias's name, while Urias just stares back calmly and says Dan's name, but the guy is clearly looking for a fight and asks if Urias is trying to make a joke out of him. Urias just looks confused, so Dan keeps going, telling Urias not to get cocky just because he somehow made it to S-rank. He's gripping his sword tight, saying there is no way that Urias could actually be better than him, so he loses his cool completely and charges forward, screaming about how Urias shouldn't be above him. He brings his blade down for a heavy strike, but Urias doesn't even bother to move. The sword hits with a massive burst of energy, and then the blade just shatters into pieces, leaving Dan standing there in total shock. Dan stands there shaking, his hand tight around the hilt of his broken sword, while his face stays hidden in the shadows. He starts laughing to himself, a low sound that turns into a full-on crazy laugh, as he stands there looking completely different. Urias catches a bad vibe and wonders if a monster is close by, but then Dan yells out, blaming Urias for everything and saying it's his own fault for underestimating. He keeps ranting about how Urias brought this on himself, and because of that, whatever happens next is totally on him, and right then, a massive, terrifying monster shows up right behind Dan's smiling face. It's a rampage spider, and Urias can't even move, just staring at the creature in total shock. Dark energy starts cracking and snapping all over the place like black lightning, and Dan starts screaming about how he finally did it, saying everything is going exactly like that person said it would. He's got this wild look in his eye, claiming that with this new power, he's officially the strongest guy alive.